What if everything you know about the beginning of human civilization rests on a single verse the Bible barely mentions? Genesis 4:16 tells us that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Most people assume this was just empty wilderness where a murderer wandered alone. But what if Nod was something far more significant, a thriving civilization that existed before recorded history, a kingdom that flourished in the shadows of Eden itself? In this investigation, we will move through three crucial discoveries. First, we will examine what ancient manuscripts reveal about this mysterious land. Then, we will uncover the bloodline that emerged from Cain's exile. And finally, we will explore why religious authorities throughout history have kept these texts hidden from public knowledge. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The name Nod itself carries weight that most biblical scholars overlook. In Hebrew, Nod means wandering or exile, but linguistic analysis reveals something deeper. The root word connects to ancient Semitic terms meaning vibration, resonance, and separation. This wasn't just a geographic location. Ancient texts describe Nod as a place removed from divine order, existing in a state between judgment and mercy. The few manuscript fragments that survived centuries of suppression paint Nod as a land where the rules of Eden no longer applied, where human consciousness developed along a completely different trajectory. Scripture gives us only fragments. Cain killed Abel. God marked Cain for protection. Cain departed to Nod. Then suddenly Cain has a wife, builds a city, and establishes a dynasty. The Bible rushes through this transition as if the details don't matter. But they matter tremendously. Where did Cain's wife come from? Who populated his city? What knowledge did he possess to build civilization so quickly? Traditional interpretation suggests Cain married his sister, that Adam and Eve had many unnamed children who spread across the earth. This explanation satisfies surface-level curiosity, but crumbles under deeper examination. Alternate manuscript traditions, particularly those preserved in Ethiopian Christianity and certain Gnostic circles, tell a different story. These texts speak of Nod as inhabited before Cain arrived. They describe a race of beings, not quite human in the Edenic sense, who possessed knowledge that predated the fall. Some scholars call them the Forgotten Ones. Others use the term Watchers, though this creates confusion with the angels mentioned in the Book of Enoch. These inhabitants of Nod existed outside the direct creative act described in Genesis, remnants of an earlier cosmic order, beings who observed humanity's birth from a distance. When Cain entered Nod, he didn't find emptiness. He found a society structured around knowledge rather than obedience, around exploration rather than submission. The inhabitants recognized something in Cain, the mark God placed on him. Ancient texts describe this mark not as a physical brand, but as a vibrational signature, a frequency that identified Cain as one who had broken the primary law, had chosen his own path regardless of divine command. In Nod, this made him not a criminal but a pioneer. The marriage between Cain and his wife, unnamed in Genesis but called Avan in some traditions, represented more than personal union. It symbolized the merger of two streams of consciousness, the Adamic line that had tasted Eden's fruit, and the Nod line that had developed entirely separate from divine revelation. Their children inherited both legacies. From Adam through Cain came the knowledge of good and evil, the awareness that disobedience was possible. From the Nod lineage came something else: practical wisdom, technological innovation, artistic expression, and perhaps most significantly, the ability to create without seeking divine approval. Genesis 4:17 tells us Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. This single verse contains revolutionary implications. City building requires massive social organization, specialized labor, agricultural surplus, defensive planning, and architectural knowledge. Cain possessed none of this before his exile. Where did he learn? The manuscript traditions suggest he learned from Nod's existing civilization, but more than that, he synthesized. He combined the spiritual awareness from Eden with the practical knowledge of Nod, creating something entirely new. This synthesis produced a culture unlike anything before or since. The descendants of Cain became the world's first metalworkers, musicians, craftsmen, and urban planners. Genesis 4:22 mentions Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. This isn't primitive toolmaking. This is advanced metallurgy requiring understanding of ore extraction, smelting temperatures, alloy composition, and forging techniques. Where did this knowledge originate? The manuscripts speak of inherited memory, knowledge passed not through teaching but through blood, through the very genetic structure of Cain's descendants. But there's a shadow side to this legacy that we cannot ignore. The same chapter that celebrates Cain's descendants' achievements also records Lamech's violent boast. Genesis 4:23 preserves his disturbing poem, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me." If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. This reveals the dark undercurrent of Nod's civilization. Freedom from divine oversight didn't produce utopia. It produced brilliance mixed with brutality, innovation married to violence, knowledge without wisdom. Ancient historians writing centuries after the flood occasionally reference pre-Diluvian civilizations whose achievements seemed impossible for their era. Josephus mentions that Seth's descendants created 2 pillars, recording astronomical and mathematical knowledge, expecting a catastrophe. If Seth's line did this, what did Cain's line accomplish? The manuscript suggests Cain's descendants created their own records, not on stone pillars, but in what they called living texts, documents that contained layered meanings that revealed different truths depending on the reader's level of understanding. These living texts form the foundation of what later became known as the Nod manuscripts, a collection of writings, symbols, and coded knowledge that supposedly survived the flood through various means. Some traditions claim Noah's wife came from Cain's line, carrying these texts onto the ark. Others suggest the knowledge survived in oral traditions among post-flood peoples. A few radical theorists propose the texts were hidden in locations that survived the deluge, waiting for rediscovery. Regardless of the transmission method, something from Nod's civilization continued after the waters receded. The early church fathers knew about these texts. Tertullian warned against them. Origen acknowledged their existence while dismissing their value. Augustine wrote cryptically about knowledge from before the covenant that certain groups preserved in defiance of divine order. The Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books, established in 1559, included references to Cainite Gospels and Nod traditions, though few copies of these texts were available even then. The suppression was thorough, systematic, and largely successful, but suppression is never complete. Throughout the Middle Ages, rumors persisted of monks who had seen fragments, of scholars who went mad after reading certain passages, of secret societies built around preserving this forbidden knowledge. The Knights Templar were accused of possessing heretical texts from the Holy Land. The Cathars were exterminated partly for their alternative creation narratives. The Rosicrucians claimed access to ancient wisdom predating biblical revelation. Were all these groups connected to the Nod manuscripts? The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. Each group emphasized knowledge over faith, direct experience over received doctrine, and human potential over divine sovereignty. The question that emerges from this investigation cuts to the heart of religious authority. If there exists knowledge from before Eden's fall, knowledge developed independently of divine revelation, what does that mean for Scripture's claim to be the ultimate source of truth? This question terrifies religious institutions because it suggests humanity's story began long before Genesis chapter 1, that our spiritual heritage is more complex and more controversial than traditional theology allows. And that brings us to a threshold. Are you ready to cross it? Because once you see what lies beyond, the comfortable narratives of childhood faith will never satisfy again. Subscribe now, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about human origins. The real investigation is just beginning. Chapter 2. The Biblical Silence. Have you ever noticed how quickly the Bible moves past certain stories, as if the details are too dangerous to record? Genesis devotes 3 chapters to creation, 3 verses to Cain's descendants, then jumps to Noah. What happened during those centuries? Who lived? What did they build? Why does Scripture remain so deliberately silent about the civilization between Eden and the flood? And understanding why the Bible refuses to elaborate on Noah's history reveals more about Scripture's purpose than 1,000 sermons ever could. The biblical account we have today went through multiple editorial processes. Scholars identify at least 4 major source traditions woven together in the first 5 books: the Yahwist, Elohist, priestly, and Deuteronomist sources. Each tradition had specific theological agendas, specific messages they wanted to convey, specific aspects of history they chose to emphasize or suppress. The priestly source, which shaped much of Genesis, focused intensely on proper worship, divine sovereignty, and the distinction between clean and unclean. A civilization that developed independently of divine guidance directly contradicted this worldview. When editors compiled Genesis during or after the Babylonian exile around the 6th century BCE, they made conscious choices about which traditions to include, which to minimize, and which to exclude entirely. The Cain narrative presented problems. It showed God's judgment failing to prevent Cain's success. It depicted the murderer of Abel becoming the father of civilization. It suggested human progress occurred apart from divine blessing. These themes didn't support the exile community's need to understand their suffering as divine punishment or their hoped-for restoration as divine reward, so the editors condensed. They gave us the basic framework: Cain's crime, his mark, his departure, his descendants' achievements, but stripped away the context that would make sense of these events. They removed the details that would explain how a lone exile established a city. They omitted the information about who inhabited Nod before Cain arrived. They glossed over the nature of knowledge his descendants possessed. This editorial silence created a void that alternative traditions rushed to fill. The Book of Jubilees, written around the 2nd century BCE and considered scripture by Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, provides more detail about the early earth. It describes how Cain's wife was his sister Awan, born in the 3rd Jubilee. It explains that humanity multiplied rapidly in those early centuries, spreading across the earth and forming various societies. But even Jubilees maintains a careful distance from Cain's actual experiences in Nod, describing his descendants' achievements without explaining their origin. The text acknowledges the gap without filling it. The Book of Enoch goes further, describing the Watchers who descended to earth, mated with human women, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. But Enoch's Watchers appear during the time of Jared, centuries after Cain. Were these the same beings who inhabited Nod? The timeline doesn't quite match, but the parallels are striking. Both narratives involve non-human entities sharing prohibited knowledge with humanity. Both result in civilizational advancement mixed with moral corruption. Both trigger divine judgment. Could Enoch's Watchers be a later echo of something that began much earlier in Nod? Gnostic texts, discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945, present yet another perspective. The Secret Book of John describes multiple creative acts, multiple levels of divine and semi-divine beings, and humans who possess sparks of the highest divinity trapped in material flesh. In this cosmology, the God of Genesis is not the ultimate source, but a lower archon, a being who created the physical world as a prison for consciousness. Cain's rebellion becomes not sin but awakening, his departure from Eden not punishment but liberation. The Gospel of Judas, authenticated in 2006, portrays Judas not as traitor but as Jesus' most faithful disciple, the only one who understood that Jesus needed to escape his physical body to return to the divine realm. This inversion of traditional narrative mirrors how alternative traditions view Cain not as history's first murderer, but as humanity's first liberator, the one who broke the spell of obedience that kept humanity childlike and dependent. If these Gnostic texts preserve earlier traditions that mainstream Judaism and Christianity suppressed, then the silence in Genesis becomes even more revealing. Jewish mystical traditions, particularly Kabbalah, speak of knowledge hidden within Scripture, accessible only through proper interpretation. Zohar discusses Cain's mark as a letter from God's name inscribed on his forehead, giving him power but also burden. It suggests Cain's descendants carried this mark spiritually, making them both gifted and cursed, capable of great achievement but incapable of rest. This interpretation transforms Cain from individual to archetype, representing all who possess creative genius mixed with inner torment, all who achieve worldly success while bearing spiritual wounds. Islamic tradition, recorded in the Quran and Hadith, tells the Cain and Abel story with slight variations but similar brevity. The Quran emphasizes the moral lesson, how envy destroys, but doesn't elaborate on Cain's subsequent life. Islamic scholars debated whether Cain repented, whether God forgave him, whether his descendants survived the flood. Some Islamic esoteric traditions, particularly certain Sufi orders, speak of pre-Adamic humanities, civilizations that existed before our current cycle, knowledge that survives in hidden lineages. These traditions may preserve echoes of Nod separate from biblical influence. The pattern across all these sources is consistent. Everyone knows something existed between Eden and the flood. Everyone acknowledges Cain's line achieved remarkable things, but no mainstream tradition wants to explore this too deeply because doing so raises uncomfortable questions. If human civilization began with a murderer, what does that say about civilization's foundation? If knowledge and progress emerged from rebellion against God, what does that say about obedience and faith? If those marked by divine judgment became history's great innovators, what does that say about divine judgment itself? Modern biblical scholarship has largely avoided these questions, preferring to treat the early Genesis narratives as mythology, theological storytelling, not meant to be historical. This approach neutralizes the controversy but also dismisses the questions. Whether Cain literally built a city or the story symbolizes something about human nature, the questions remain. What is the relationship between moral order and creative achievement? Can goodness exist without freedom to choose evil? Does spiritual advancement require rebellion against authority? These questions matter whether we read Genesis as history or parable. The silence speaks volumes. What the Bible refuses to say often matters more than what it records. Genesis gives us enough information to know something significant happened in Nod, but not enough to understand what. This calculated ambiguity has protected religious authority for millennia, allowing interpreters to fill the gaps in ways that support their theological positions while avoiding the radical implications of what those gaps might actually contain. But that protection is crumbling. Archaeological discoveries, textual analysis, and comparative religion are filling in the silence, and what they reveal is far more complex and far more challenging than traditional religion can comfortably accommodate. Like this video if you are starting to see the cracks in the official story, because what we will discover next will widen those cracks into chasms. Chapter 3: Cain's Mark and Ancient Bloodlines. What does it mean to be marked by God? Genesis 4:15 tells us the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Traditional interpretation treats this as a visible sign, perhaps a tattoo or scar, warning others not to harm Cain. But ancient manuscript traditions describe something far more profound, a fundamental alteration in Cain's nature, a change that affected not just him but everyone descended from him, a bloodline that carries both blessing and curse through all generations. The Hebrew word for mark is oph, which appears throughout Scripture with various meanings. It is the same word used for the rainbow after the flood, God's sign of covenant with Noah. It describes the Sabbath as a sign between God and Israel. It refers to the signs and wonders performed in Egypt during the Exodus. In every case, Oth means more than a visual symbol. It represents a reality shift, a fundamental change in the relationship between heaven and earth, between God and humanity, between what was and what will be. When God marked Cain, something changed at a level deeper than skin. Ancient Hebrew mysticism describes this as a spiritual brand, an alteration in Cain's soul frequency that made him recognizable to all beings, physical and spiritual. This mark announced that Cain existed outside normal divine protection, but under special divine prohibition. Anyone who killed him would face sevenfold vengeance, not because God favored Cain, but because God had reserved Cain for a specific purpose, to demonstrate that even the fallen can build, that even the cursed can create, that judgment does not equal destruction. Rabbinic tradition debates the nature of Cain's mark extensively. Some say God caused a horn to grow from Cain's forehead. Others claim his face turned green, or that he trembled constantly. The Midrash suggests God gave Cain a dog for protection or made the sun shine specially upon him. These varying interpretations reveal the challenge ancient scholars faced. They knew the mark was real, was significant, but couldn't agree on its manifestation because it operated at a level beyond simple physical description. The Kabbalistic tradition offers the most sophisticated interpretation. The Zohar teaches that God inscribed a letter from the divine name on Cain's forehead, specifically the letter Vav, which represents connection, linkage, and the number 6 in Hebrew numerology. This letter served as both protection and prison, connecting Cain to divine power while separating him from divine presence. Cain could access creative force but not intimate relationship. He could build civilizations but not know peace. The mark gave much but cost more. This interpretation transforms our understanding of Cain's descendants. If the mark was genetic, passed through bloodlines, then everyone descended from Cain carried this same dual nature, gifted with exceptional creative ability, burdened with inner restlessness, capable of building empires but incapable of finding home. Ancient texts describe Cain's line as the hammer builders, the fireworkers, the song makers, terms that emphasize their practical achievements while hinting at something driven, something compulsive in their nature. Genesis 4:17-22 lists 7 generations from Cain to Lamech's children, and each generation shows increasing specialization and sophistication. Enoch has a city. Irad appears in Sumerian king lists. Mehujael's name means smitten by God, suggesting continued divine interaction. Methushael means man of God, an ironic name for Cain's descendant. Lamech introduces polygamy, marrying Ada and Zillah. Their children invent nomadic herding, musical instruments, and metallurgy. This is not random progress. This is directed evolution of human capability. Compare this to Seth's line, born to replace murdered Abel. Genesis 4:26 tells us that in Seth's days, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Seth's descendants developed spiritually while Cain's developed materially. Seth's line produced Enoch, who walked with God and was taken to heaven. Cain's line produced Enoch, who built a city. 2 paths diverged, 2 approaches to human existence, one seeking vertical connection with divinity, one seeking horizontal expansion across earth. Which path was right? The Bible clearly favors Seth, whose line continued through Noah. But Cain's path produced civilization. Ancient bloodline theories suggest these 2 lines represent opposing principles, still active in humanity. Some people are drawn to spiritual matters, contemplation, simplicity, and relationship with the divine. Others are driven to build, create, innovate, and transform the material world. Traditional religion values the first type. Civilization requires the second. Most people contain both impulses in varying proportions. The eternal tension between being and doing, between acceptance and ambition, between faith and works. Genetic research, particularly studies of human migration patterns and DNA analysis, reveals fascinating patterns that might relate to these ancient narratives. Mitochondrial Eve studies suggest all humans descend from a woman who lived roughly 150,000 years ago in Africa. Y chromosome Adam lived perhaps 200,000 years ago. But these are not the only genetic ancestors. Population genetics shows multiple waves of human migration, interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and complex patterns of gene flow that resulted in modern humans being a mixture of several ancestral populations. Could the Cain and Seth narrative be preserving memory of different human populations that merged in prehistory? Could the mark of Cain represent introduction of genes from a separate hominin species? Modern science places this mixing tens of thousands of years before the biblical timeline, but ancient peoples didn't think in terms of deep time. They compressed vast prehistory into genealogies spanning centuries. The core truth they preserved may not be the timeline, but the fact of mixture, that humanity as we know it emerged from the blending of different streams, and those streams contributed different strengths and weaknesses. Mystery schools throughout history have claimed to preserve knowledge of these bloodlines and their characteristics. Freemasonry's legend of Tubal Cain, honored as the first craftsman and given special recognition in certain degrees, connects directly to Genesis 4022. Rosicrucian traditions speak of bloodlines carrying special abilities, though they frame this as spiritual heritage rather than genetic. Certain Gnostic sects divided humanity into pneumatics, psychics, and helics, those led by spirit, those led by soul, and those led by matter, categories that suspiciously parallel the different biblical lineages. Conspiracy theories about bloodlines descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, popularized in books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, may actually be distorted echoes of earlier traditions about Cain's bloodline surviving the flood. If you want to hide something, bury it under a more recent, more controllable secret. The medieval obsession with proving royal ancestry, traced back to King David or Trojan princes, may mask older concerns about proving descent from pre-flood lineages, about demonstrating one's blood carried the mark of the builders. This raises a disturbing question. Does human inequality have spiritual or genetic roots? Do some bloodlines truly carry advantages that others lack? Every culture has myths of special lineages, demigods, heroes born from the union of mortals and immortals, kings who ruled by divine right. Modern egalitarian values reject such ideas as justifications for oppression. But what if the myths preserve truth? Not that some deserve more than others, but that humans genuinely possess different capacities, different wiring, different drives based on ancestral inheritance. Science confirms that intelligence, personality, and abilities have genetic components, though environment shapes their expression. Twin studies show identical twins raised apart still share remarkable similarities. Certain populations show statistical advantages in specific abilities. Ashkenazi Jews in verbal and mathematical reasoning, East Africans in distance running, Polynesians in navigation. Modern discourse avoids these facts, fearing misuse for racist purposes. But ignoring truth doesn't make it disappear. It just drives it underground where it festers. The mark of Cain may be the Bible's way of preserving ancient knowledge about human diversity, about how different populations emerged with different strengths, about how those differences stem from deep history and divine purpose. This interpretation doesn't justify oppression. It explains why humanity has always been diverse, why some groups excel in certain domains, why inequality exists despite our best efforts to eliminate it. The question is not whether differences exist, but how we respond to them. Do we use differences to justify domination, creating hierarchies of worth? Or do we recognize that human civilization requires all types, that the contemplatives need the builders, and the builders need the contemplatives, that Cain and Seth are both necessary, that the mark is not curse or blessing but identity, calling, purpose? Ancient traditions understood this. They knew Cain's line would produce the metalworkers and musicians that Seth's line needed. They knew Seth's line would produce the prophets and priests that Cain's line needed. Separation was never the point. Integration was. But that integration never happened before the flood. The two lines remained separate until Genesis 6, when boundaries finally broke down. And that mixing, that crossing of the lines that were meant to remain distinct, triggered the catastrophe that destroyed the world. Comment below if you've ever felt marked, different, called to something that no one around you understands. Because we are about to explore what happened when the separated bloodlines merged, and the result was worse than anyone imagined. Chapter 4. The Land East of Eden. Where exactly was Nod? The Bible says east of Eden, but where was Eden? Scholars have debated this for millennia, proposing locations in Mesopotamia, Armenia, Ethiopia, even underwater in the Persian Gulf. Without knowing Eden's location, finding Nod seems impossible. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Nod was never meant to be found on any map because it existed in a different kind of space, what ancient texts call the Betweenlands, regions that bridge physical and spiritual dimensions. Genesis 2:10-14 describes Eden's geography with remarkable specificity. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The first is Pishon, flowing around the land of Havilah where there is gold. The second is Gihon, flowing around the land of Cush. The third is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. The fourth is Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates still exist, major rivers in modern Iraq, but Pishon and Gihon have vanished from geography. Some scholars identify Gihon with the Nile because later scripture uses Gihon to name a spring in Jerusalem, and Egyptian connections appear throughout early Genesis. Others propose ancient rivers that dried up when climate changed after the last ice age. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have identified dry riverbeds beneath Arabian sands that once carried substantial water. The most convincing theory places Eden in southern Mesopotamia, where the 4 rivers would have met before flowing into the Persian Gulf, a location now underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise. If Eden was in southern Mesopotamia, then East would place Nod in western Iran, in the region ancient texts call Elam. Archaeological evidence shows Elam developed civilization very early, contemporary with Sumeria, with its own writing system, religious traditions, and political structures. Elamite civilization lasted thousands of years, only finally conquered by Persians and later Alexander. Could Elam be the historical remnant of Nod? The timing matches, the location matches, and Elam's mysterious origins, not quite Semitic, not quite Indo-European, fit the profile of a people with separate ancestry. But there is a problem. The Bible's timeline doesn't work with archaeology's timeline. If we take Genesis genealogies literally, Eden existed perhaps 6,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence places Sumerian and Elamite civilizations emerging around 5,000 years ago. Possible match, but the flood comes just 10 generations after Adam, perhaps 1,600 years. The flood supposedly destroyed all civilization, yet Sumerian cities show no evidence of catastrophic destruction at the dates biblical chronology suggests. Either the timeline is wrong or the interpretation is wrong. Jewish and Christian scholars proposed solutions. Some suggest gaps in the genealogies, that when scripture says A fathered B, it might mean A was ancestor of B with generations omitted. This allows stretching the timeline to match archaeology. Others propose the flood was local, devastating Mesopotamia, but not the whole world, explaining why Egyptian and Chinese civilizations show no catastrophic breaks. Still others treat Genesis as theological narrative rather than historical chronicle, teaching spiritual truths through symbolic stories not meant to be mapped onto archaeology. But what if the timeline problem points to something else? What if Nod existed in a time outside normal time, in what quantum physics might call a parallel timeline? Ancient texts sometimes describe such places: the land of the Fae in Celtic mythology, the realm of the Jinn in Islamic tradition, Avalon in Arthurian legend, the hollow hills where time moves differently, and years pass in days or days stretch into years. What if Nod was this kind of place, physically east of Eden, but temporally separate, a pocket reality where different rules applied? This interpretation sounds like fantasy, but it makes sense of otherwise inexplicable details. How did Cain build a city so quickly if he was alone in empty wilderness? But if he entered a place where time flowed differently, where what seemed like years to him was much longer in Eden's timeline, he could have lived centuries, raised multiple generations, and developed full civilization before anyone from Eden even noticed he was gone. The mark God gave him might have enabled this transition, allowing him to perceive and enter the between space where Nod existed. Ancient mystical traditions speak of such transitions. Shamanic journeys describe entering different realms where spirits dwell, realms that coexist with physical reality but remain invisible to normal perception. Near-death experiences report similar phenomena, entering places that feel more real than Earth, where time has no meaning, where deceased loved ones wait. Alien abduction accounts describe missing time, hours that pass in minutes or minutes that stretch to hours. DMT experiences consistently involve entering realms populated by intelligent entities in spaces that seem to exist perpendicular to normal reality. What if these experiences point to real features of consciousness and cosmos that ancient peoples understood better than moderns? What if materialism's insistence that only physical matter exists has blinded us to dimensions of reality our ancestors navigated naturally? Quantum physics has already demonstrated that particles exist in superposition, occupying multiple states simultaneously until observed, that entangled particles affect each other instantaneously across vast distances, that the observer shapes the observed. Reality is far stranger than common sense suggests. In this framework, Nod becomes not a place you travel to physically, but a state you transition into consciously. Cain left Eden not just geographically, but perceptually, exiting the reality where divine presence was immediately felt and entering a reality where material existence took precedence. This explains why he could find a wife and community. They were already there, had always been there, but in a different frequency of existence that Cain could only perceive after his transformation through Abel's death and God's mark. This interpretation radically changes what the Nod manuscripts might be. They are not historical documents in the normal sense, but guides for transition, instructions for moving between states of consciousness, techniques for accessing the betweenlands that exist alongside but separate from normal reality. This is why they seem to change based on the reader, why they supposedly drive some mad while enlightening others. They are not conveying information, but facilitating transformation. Not teaching about Nod, but opening a door into Nod that still exists, still waiting, still calling to those who carry the mark. If this sounds too esoteric, too removed from biblical faith, consider what Jesus taught about the kingdom of heaven. He repeatedly said it was near, at hand, within you, not located in the sky, but accessible through transformed perception. He said you must be born again to see it, suggesting ordinary consciousness cannot perceive it. He spoke in parables because the mysteries of the kingdom were not for everyone, only for those with ears to hear. He demonstrated access to this kingdom through miracles that violated normal physics, walking on water, multiplying food, healing with touch, raising the dead. What if Jesus' kingdom of heaven and the land of Nod are pointing to the same reality structure, to dimensions of existence that interpenetrate physical reality but require transformed consciousness to access? What if the difference is that the kingdom comes through submission to divine will, while Nod comes through assertion of human will, two doors into the same space, two paths to the same power, one walked by saints and one walked by sorcerers? And what if most humans spend their lives unaware that either door exists, living entirely in surface reality, never suspecting the depths above and below? Share this video with someone who needs to know that reality is far larger than we have been taught, because we are about to explore what Cain built in Nod, and those structures still shape our world today in ways that will astonish you. Chapter 5. The First City Builder. Genesis 4:1-7 drops a revelation so casually that most readers miss its significance. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. He built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Pause here. Cain built a city, not a village, not a settlement, but a city. This single sentence requires us to completely reconsider everything we think we know about early human civilization and what may have been lost to the flood. Archaeological evidence shows the first cities emerging around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, places like Uruk and Eridu that grew from agricultural villages into urban centers with specialized occupations, monumental architecture, writing systems, and centralized authority. Before this, humans lived in small bands as hunter-gatherers, then in farming villages. The transition to city life required multiple innovations. irrigation systems, crop storage, pottery for surplus management, record keeping that led to writing, social hierarchies, religious institutions, defensive walls, and conceptual frameworks for organizing thousands of people who were not family members. These innovations did not happen overnight. They developed over millennia through countless small advances and experiments. Yet Genesis presents Cain building a city within one generation of leaving Eden. Either the biblical timeline compresses vast history into genealogical shorthand, or Cain possessed knowledge that enabled rapid urban development, or the story preserves memory of a much earlier, pre-flood civilization whose achievements were later forgotten and had to be rediscovered. All three explanations are possible. All three are disturbing in their implications. If Cain compressed millennia of normal development into years, he must have had help. The manuscript traditions say he did. They describe him learning from Nod's inhabitants, beings who had observed Eden from the outside, who had developed technologies that did not rely on divine blessing but on understanding hidden patterns in nature. These beings taught Cain principles of organization and construction, how to motivate people to work toward collective goals, how to transform landscapes to support concentrated populations, how to encode knowledge in symbols that could be transmitted across generations. The city Cain built was not like later cities. It was designed according to principles that later civilizations forgot or deliberately abandoned. Ancient texts describe it as built on a grid aligned to celestial patterns, with structures placed at energetically significant points, with acoustics designed to amplify consciousness-altering frequencies, with geometry that reflected cosmic order. This sounds like fantasy until you examine real ancient cities that show similar planning. Teotihuacan in Mexico with its astronomical alignments, Angkor Wat in Cambodia built as a map of the cosmos, the Great Pyramid at Giza incorporating multiple mathematical constants, stone circles across Europe positioned at locations of telluric energy. Who taught these civilizations their advanced planning? Mainstream archaeology credits independent invention, saying humans in different locations separately discovered similar principles. But an alternative hypothesis suggests a common source, a mother civilization that preceded all others, whose knowledge spread across the world and fragments survived in various locations. Plato's Atlantis is the most famous version of this hypothesis. Theosophy's Lemuria is another. Graham Hancock's research into structures he dates to Ice Age argues for a lost civilization of the Younger Dryas period, around 10,000 BCE. Could Cain City have been that source civilization? The timeline is wrong for standard archaeology, but if we accept that the flood narrative preserves memory of actual catastrophe, perhaps the Black Sea flood around 5600 BCE or earlier glacial melting events, then a pre-catastrophe civilization could have existed, could have achieved sophistication beyond what we assume for that era, could have been destroyed with only fragmentary memories surviving in myth and legend. Cain's city would have been the prototype, the first attempt to organize human society at scale according to principles that later became occult, hidden wisdom preserved in mystery schools. The city's name is significant. Enoch in Hebrew is Chanok, meaning dedicated or trained. The root relates to education, initiation, the transmission of specialized knowledge. Naming the city Enoch declared its purpose not just as habitation, but as school, as temple, as place where humans could be trained in arts and sciences that transformed consciousness. Later tradition attributed the Book of Enoch to Cain's descendant, but to Seth's descendant, Enoch, who walked with God. But perhaps there were two Enochs, two traditions of esoteric knowledge, one from Cain's line focused on material mastery, one from Seth's line focused on spiritual ascension, both teaching how to transcend normal human limitations but through opposite means. The structure of Cain's city would have reflected his unique psychology, the psychology of the exile, the marked, the unforgiven who refuses to accept condemnation. It would have been a city of ambition and innovation, of restless creativity and dark undercurrents, of achievement shadowed by violence, of beauty mixed with corruption. Genesis 4:1019-24 describes Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-great-grandson, As the first polygamist and a boastful murderer, the culture Cain founded valued strength and cleverness over righteousness, success over virtue, glory over holiness. This culture produced civilization's first artists. Jubal, son of Lamech by Ada, was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Music did not exist before this, at least not as a developed art. Birds sing, wolves howl, but only humans make music deliberately, manipulating sound to evoke emotion and alter consciousness. Jubal's invention, or perhaps his revelation of musical principles, represents a fundamental shift in human capacity, the ability to create beauty for its own sake, to shape reality through art rather than labor, to influence others through aesthetic experience rather than force. Music's power should not be underestimated. Ancient traditions treated music as sacred technology. Pythagoras taught that musical intervals reflected cosmic order, that certain scales and modes affected human health and behavior. The Bible records David's harp driving evil spirits from Saul. Sufi dervishes use music to enter ecstatic states. Shamans worldwide employ drumming and chanting to journey to other realms. Modern research confirms music affects brainwave patterns, hormone production, and emotional states. Jubal gave humanity a tool to hack consciousness, and that tool came from Cain's line, not Seth's. Similarly, Tubal-Cain, Jubal's half-brother by Lamech's other wife Zillah, was the instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Metallurgy requires sophisticated understanding of geology, chemistry, and thermodynamics. Finding ore, extracting metal, achieving temperatures sufficient for smelting, creating alloys with desired properties, forging and casting finished products. Each step requires knowledge that seems advanced for the time Genesis places it. Yet Tubal-Cain possessed this knowledge and taught it to others, creating a class of specialists whose skills seemed almost magical to those who lacked them. Metal transformed human civilization. Bronze weapons and tools outperformed stone, enabling more efficient agriculture, more effective warfare, more sophisticated craftsmanship. Iron eventually surpassed bronze, harder and more widely available, making metal tools accessible beyond elite classes. The transition from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age marks critical thresholds in human development. And according to Genesis, these transitions originated with Cain's descendants, with those marked by divine judgment but gifted with creative genius. Subscribe now if you are starting to wonder whether civilization itself might be built on a foundation that religion cannot fully accept. Because we are about to meet Cain's city's most mysterious resident, the other Enoch, and discover why two figures with the same name point toward a truth that threatened to unravel reality. Chapter 6: Enoch and the Hidden Legacy. The Bible presents two Enochs, and their parallel stories contain mysteries that scholars still debate. Cain's son, for whom he named his city, disappears from the narrative after one verse, but Seth's descendant Enoch, seventh generation from Adam just as Lamech was seventh from Cain, receives 3 verses in Genesis and an entire apocalyptic tradition. Genesis 5:2 says Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This cryptic phrase inspired centuries of speculation. What does it mean to walk with God? Where did God take him? And why does this Enoch merit such special treatment? The Book of Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic text written between 300 and 100 BCE, massively expands Enoch's story. It describes him receiving visions of heaven, earth, and the coming judgment. He sees the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, mated with human women, and taught forbidden knowledge. He witnesses the punishment awaiting these Watchers and their giant offspring. He learns the secrets of cosmology, meteorology, and calendar keeping. He is shown the final judgment when God will destroy the wicked and vindicate the righteous. The book was hugely influential in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. But here is the strange part. Much of what the Book of Enoch describes, the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge, the mixing of different races, the corruption of humanity through advanced information, mirrors what the Nod manuscripts allegedly describe happening in Cain's city. Are these the same events told from different perspectives? Is Seth's Enoch receiving visions of what Cain's Enoch already lived? Or are there two separate traditions, two streams of hidden knowledge, that later scribes tried to separate but that originally were connected? Consider the parallels. The Watchers descended in the days of Jared, Enoch's father, approximately the same era that Cain's city would have been flourishing. They taught humans metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and herb lore, exactly the kind of knowledge Tubal-Cain and his relatives possessed. They took human wives and produced the Nephilim, giants of renown, just as Cain took a wife from Nod's inhabitants, presumably producing hybrid offspring. The Watchers' teachings corrupted humanity, leading to violence and evil, just as Lamech boasted of violence in Cain's lineage. The pattern is too similar to be coincidence. What if Cain's line and the Watchers were actually the same phenomenon described from different viewpoints? The Watchers descended, meaning they came from outside normal human society, just as Cain was exiled from Eden. They possessed knowledge, just as Cain possessed the mark. They intermarried with humans, just as Cain married in Nod. Their children became mighty, just as Cain's children became innovators. The primary difference is perspective. The Book of Enoch, written from the standpoint of Seth's righteous line, treats the Watchers as fallen angels who corrupted humanity. The Nod manuscripts, if they exist, would tell the same story from the perspective of those who saw it as enlightenment rather than corruption. This creates a fascinating hermeneutical question. Is forbidden knowledge actually evil, or is it called forbidden by authorities who want to maintain monopoly on power? The Watchers taught metallurgy, which enabled war but also agriculture. They taught cosmetics, which enabled vanity but also medicine. They taught astrology, which enabled superstition but also timekeeping and navigation. Every technology is dual use, empowering noble and ignoble purposes equally. Condemning knowledge itself rather than its application is a strategy of control, not wisdom. Seth's Enoch, the one who walked with God, would have opposed this knowledge, would have seen it as corrupting the simple relationship between humanity and Creator that existed in Eden. His visions showed him that the Watchers' teachings led to judgment, to the flood that would destroy the world and start over. He warned his contemporaries, but was taken to heaven before the catastrophe, spared from witnessing the destruction. His book preserves the perspective that obedience to divine order is humanity's proper path, and any deviation leads to ruin. Cain's Enoch, the city builder, represented the opposite perspective. He embraced knowledge from any source, built structures to reach toward heaven rather than waiting for heaven to come to him, organized society according to human ingenuity rather than divine command. His legacy was civilization itself, imperfect, violent, brilliant, and doomed. His story was suppressed because it demonstrated that humans could achieve great things without divine blessing, that progress and righteousness were not synonymous, that God's favor and worldly success could diverge completely. The tension between these two Enochs, these two approaches to human existence, runs through all of biblical history. It appears in the Tower of Babel story, where humanity united to build a structure reaching heaven and God confused their languages to prevent completion. It appears in the contrast between Israel's judges, who relied on divine intervention, and Israel's kings, who built professional armies. It appears in Jesus' conflicts with religious authorities who value tradition over healing, law over love, purity codes over compassion. It appears in Christianity's split into contemplative monastics and worldly crusaders. Modern society claims to resolve this tension through separation of church and state, private faith and public secularism. But the tension remains. Do we advance through technology or through spirituality? Do we solve problems through innovation or through prayer? Do we value prophets or engineers, priests or scientists, revelation or research? Most people want both, want technological comfort and spiritual meaning, material success and moral purpose, but consistently achieving both is rare. Usually, one dominates at the expense of the other. The Enoch tradition suggests that humanity has always faced this choice and that catastrophe comes when the balance tips too far in either direction. Cain's line, All material progress and no spiritual grounding led to corruption and violence that made the flood necessary. But Seth's line, all spiritual purity and no practical development, would have left humanity vulnerable and stagnant. Noah, the one who survived, came from Seth's line but built the ark through practical knowledge. He combined both traditions, spiritual obedience providing the vision and material skill providing the execution. This is the hidden legacy of the two Enochs. Humanity needs both paths. We need those who walk with God, who maintain connection to transcendent values, who remind us that we are more than matter. We also need those who build cities, who harness natural forces, who push boundaries and refuse limitations. The tragedy is that these two groups usually oppose each other rather than recognizing their complementarity, and that opposition, that refusal to integrate the spiritual and material, the vertical and horizontal, the contemplative and creative, is what truly invites judgment. The manuscripts, whether from Nod or from Enoch's heavenly visions, agree on one essential point. The separation must end. The fragmented consciousness must reintegrate. The exile must return, not to Eden, which is forever barred, but to a new synthesis beyond Eden, where the tree of life and the tree of knowledge are recognized as one tree with two aspects, where divine presence and human achievement work together rather than apart. But that integration comes at a cost: the death of certainty, the loss of simple answers, the acceptance of paradox and mystery. Are you ready for that cost? Comment your honest answer, because what comes next will test that readiness like nothing before. Chapter 7, The Daughters of Men, Genesis 6:1-4, contains one of the Bible's strangest passages, and it comes immediately after describing Seth's righteous line and immediately before describing the flood's necessity. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of Raun Aun. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? What were the daughters of men? What were the Nephilim? Traditional interpretation says the sons of God were angels, the daughters of men were human women, and the Nephilim were their hybrid offspring, giants who spread corruption across the earth. But alternative interpretation says the sons of God were Seth's descendants, the daughters of men were Cain's descendants, and the Nephilim were the result of the two separated lines finally interbreeding. Both interpretations have problems and both point toward the same conclusion: something terrible happened when boundaries were crossed. The Hebrew phrase, sons of God, Bene Elohim, appears elsewhere in Scripture, notably in Job 1006 and 2:1, where it clearly refers to angelic beings presenting themselves before the Lord. This supports the traditional view that Genesis 6 describes angels taking human wives, but the same phrase can simply mean worshippers of God, those who belonged to God's community, which supports the view that it means Seth's righteous line. The ambiguity may be deliberate. Both interpretations are true in different ways, pointing toward a reality too complex for simple categorization. If we accept that sons of God means angels, we must deal with uncomfortable implications. Angels are typically portrayed as non-physical or differently physical, messengers and warriors without gender or reproductive capacity. Jesus says in Matthew 22:30 that in the resurrection people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. If angels don't marry and presumably don't reproduce, how could they produce offspring with humans? The text doesn't explain, which has led to elaborate theories about angels taking physical form, possessing human bodies, or engaging in spiritual union that somehow produced physical results. The Book of Enoch provides extensive detail about this event, naming the leaders of the rebellious angels. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, and taught women cosmetics and jewelry. Semyaza, the leader, taught enchantments and root cutting. Amaros taught resolving enchantments. Berekil taught astrology. Kokabeel taught omens. Tamiel taught astrology. Asradel taught the course of the moon. This is identical to the knowledge that emerged from Cain's line: metallurgy, cosmetics, herbal medicine, astrology, all the practical arts that built civilization but also enabled warfare, vanity, and occult practices. The alternative interpretation avoids angelic reproduction problems by identifying the sons of God as Seth's line and daughters of men as Cain's line. This makes Genesis 6:1-4 describe the breaking down of the separation between the two lineages. Seth's descendants, who called on the Lord's name, who maintained spiritual purity, who avoided Cain's culture, finally succumbed to temptation. They saw that Cain's daughters were attractive and took them as wives, mixing the holy and profane seeds, ending the genetic and cultural separation that had preserved righteousness. This interpretation connects to numerous biblical warnings against mixed marriage. Israel was commanded not to marry Canaanites, not for racial reasons, but for religious reasons, because marriage led to adopting foreign gods. Ezra and Nehemiah forced Israelites to divorce foreign wives after the Babylonian exile to prevent apostasy. The New Testament warns believers not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. The principle is consistent: maintain separation to preserve spiritual integrity, because mixing leads to compromise, leads to corruption, leads to judgment. But there is a third interpretation that reconciles both views. What if the sons of God were a special group that combined angelic and Sethite characteristics? What if Seth's line, through their spiritual practices, their walking with God, their intimate relationship with divine presence, had achieved a state that made them more than merely human, not quite angelic but elevated, carriers of divine frequency in their bloodline? And what if Cain's line, through their alliance with Nod's inhabitants, had incorporated non-human genetics, or at least non-Edenic human genetics, making them more than merely Adamic? In this framework, both lines had become superhuman in different ways. Seth's line carried divine spark, spiritual power, the ability to channel heavenly authority. Cain's line carried practical genius, material mastery, the ability to manipulate physical reality. When these two enhanced lines finally interbred, the result was not simple admixture, but explosive combination, producing the Nephilim, beings who combined both types of superiority, spiritual and material, divine authority and earthly power. These were the mighty men of old, men of renown, heroes who could perform impossible feats because they drew on both sources of superhuman ability. But this combination was unstable: too much power without sufficient wisdom, too much ability without adequate constraint. The Nephilim did not use their gifts for good, but for self-aggrandizement, conquest, and exploitation. They became tyrants, warrior kings, the demigods of later mythology: Hercules, Gilgamesh, Achilles, beings who straddled the line between human and divine, whose stories mix historical and mythological elements because they were themselves mixtures that defied categorization. Genesis 6:5 describes the result. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is not ordinary human sin. This is systematic intentional evil, a culture built on exploitation and violence, where power determined right and where the strong devoured the weak without restraint. This is what happens when boundaries designed for protection are breached, when knowledge meant to remain separated combines, when power accumulates without corresponding responsibility. The flood becomes necessary to reset the system, to eliminate the corrupted hybrid population, and start over with Noah, the one man who remained genetically pure and righteous. But Genesis 6:4 includes a troubling phrase. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward meaning after the flood. The hybrid line survived somehow, either through Noah's wife, or through one of his son's wives, or through some survivors who escaped the flood in other locations. The Nephilim genetics continued. And this explains why Israel, when entering Canaan, encountered giants, Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, according to Numbers 13:33. This survival means the issue was never resolved. The contamination, or enhancement depending on perspective, persisted through history. Bloodlines carrying both spiritual and material superiority continued, sometimes hidden, sometimes ruling openly. Mystery schools preserved knowledge of these bloodlines and techniques for activating dormant abilities. Royal families claimed descent from gods. Initiates underwent transformations that awakened their hidden nature. The story that began with Cain and Seth, that escalated with the sons of God and daughters of men, that produced the Nephilim, never ended. It just went underground. And according to the manuscript traditions, it is surfacing again now. The barriers between worlds are thinning. The separation between lineages is breaking down once more. Genetic engineering is creating hybrids deliberately. Artificial intelligence is producing entities that mirror the Nephilim's combination of superhuman ability and inhuman nature. We are approaching another threshold, another moment when boundaries will breach and reality will transform. The question is whether this time we will handle the integration better than our ancestors did. Share this video if you believe we are living in days like the days of Noah, because the parallels are about to become undeniable. Chapter 8: The Watchers' Connection. The Book of Enoch devotes extensive detail to the Watchers, their descent, their teachings, and their punishment. Understanding these beings is crucial to understanding the pre-flood world and possibly our current moment. Enoch 6:1-8 describes how 200 Watchers, led by Semiezer, descended on Mount Hermon during the days of Jared, Enoch's father. They made a pact, binding themselves with mutual curses because they knew their plan was transgression. They descended, took wives, and began teaching forbidden knowledge. Mount Hermon is significant. Located at the northern edge of Israel, it is the highest point in the region, snow-capped year-round, visible for miles. Ancient peoples considered mountains as meeting places between earth and heaven, places where gods descended and humans ascended. The name Hermon relates to the Hebrew word for devoted to destruction, or banned, suggesting the mountain had a sinister reputation even in ancient times. This is where Jesus took Peter, James, and John for the transfiguration according to some interpretations, redeeming the location where Watchers fell by revealing his divine glory. The Watchers were not demons but angels, created beings with specific responsibilities in the divine order. Jewish tradition described multiple orders of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, powers, and more, each with specific functions. The Watchers were apparently tasked with observing humanity, perhaps guiding and protecting, but explicitly prohibited from direct interference. Their descent broke this prohibition, abandoning their assigned position for forbidden relationship with humans. Why would angels do this? The text suggests desire for the daughters of men, but that seems incomplete. Angels presumably don't experience sexual desire in the way humans do. A deeper reading suggests the Watchers desired what humanity possessed: physical existence, material experience, the ability to create and produce offspring, to build and shake matter, to taste food and feel sunshine and know mortality. Angels were greater than humans in power and knowledge, but humans possessed something angels lacked: the experience of being finite, temporal, incarnate, limited. The Watchers wanted that experience. Their teachings were not randomly chosen. Each angel taught something specific that advanced human capability but also increased human corruption. Azazel's metallurgy enabled both agriculture and warfare. Cosmetics beautified but also enabled deception. Astrology helped navigation but encouraged fatalism. Herb lore healed but also enabled poisoning. Every gift was double-edged, able to be used for good or evil, and humans in their fallen state tended toward evil applications. This pattern appears repeatedly in human history. Every technological advance brings dangers alongside benefits. Fire warms but burns. Writing preserves knowledge but enables propaganda. Printing spreads truth but spreads lies just as easily. Television connects but isolates. Internet empowers but addicts. Artificial intelligence assists but threatens to replace. The problem is never technology itself, but the moral state of those wielding it. and humanity's moral state, according to Genesis, was deteriorating rapidly during the Watchers era. Enoch 7:1-6 describes the Nephilim born from these unions. They grew to enormous size, consumed all human resources, then began eating people and drinking blood. They attacked animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, eating their flesh and drinking their blood. The earth brought accusation against them before heaven. This is nightmare imagery, describing not just large people but monstrous beings whose appetites could not be satisfied, who consumed everything in their path, who treated all other life as food. Whether literal or metaphorical, it represents total corruption, life turning against life, power used to devour rather than to protect. God's response came in stages. First, he sent Enoch to announce judgment to the Watchers. They would see their children destroy each other, would be bound in earth-deep places for 70 generations, then face final judgment at the end of time. The Nephilim would kill each other, but their spirits would become demons, evil spirits on earth, causing mischief, temptation, and destruction until the end. Then God commanded the angel Gabriel to cause the Nephilim to turn on each other, destroying themselves through internal warfare. Finally, he commanded the angel Uriel to warn Noah to prepare for the flood that would cleanse the earth. The flood comes as both punishment and mercy. It punishes the wicked generation but also prevents them from continuing. It destroys the corrupted genetic lines but preserves Noah's family, who remained pure. It ends the first experiment in human civilization but allows a fresh start. The 40 days and nights of rain, the months underwater, the slow recession, all symbolize death, burial, and resurrection. The world that emerged after the flood was physically the same earth, but spiritually a new creation. Except, as mentioned earlier, Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim existed after the flood also, and Numbers 13:33 confirms that Israelite spies saw Nephilim in Canaan. How did they survive? The most common explanation is that the genetics persisted through Noah's family, specifically through his sons' wives, who were not daughters of Noah and whose lineage is not specified. If one or more of these women carried Nephilim ancestry, their children would reintroduce the hybrid genetics into post-flood humanity. This explains the commands for Israel to completely destroy certain Canaanite peoples. Deuteronomy 7:1-2 lists 7 nations greater and mightier than Israel that must be utterly destroyed, no covenant made, no mercy shown. This seems horrifically genocidal by modern standards. But if these nations were Nephilim descendants, genetically corrupted lines that would spread their contamination if allowed to survive, the command becomes quarantine rather than genocide, removing a cancer before it metastasizes. Israel's failure to completely obey this command meant Nephilim genetics persisted, continued to corrupt, and eventually infiltrated Israel itself. King David's battles with giants illustrate this. Goliath of Gath stood over 9 feet tall. His armor weighed 125 pounds. His spear point weighed 15 pounds. He came from a family of giants. 2 Samuel 21:15-22 describes 4 different giants from Gath, one with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, all killed by David's men. These were not mere genetic anomalies. They were remnants of the pre-flood hybrid line that somehow survived and concentrated in specific locations, particularly among Philistines and other coastal peoples. The Watcher's story parallels myths from cultures worldwide. Greek mythology describes titans, supernatural beings who preceded gods, who mixed with humans producing heroes. Hindu texts describe asuras, powerful beings in conflict with devas, who taught humans advanced technologies. Norse mythology features Jotnar, giants who opposed but also interacted with gods. Sumerian myths describe Anunnaki, beings from the heavens who genetically modified primitive humans to create workers. Native American legends speak of star people who descended, taught, and intermarried with humans. These parallels suggest either these myths all draw from memory of real events in prehistory, the events Genesis and Enoch describe, or there is something archetypal about the Watcher narrative, something that resonates with deep human psychology regardless of whether it literally happened. Either interpretation has profound implications. If literal, then humanity has been hybrid from very early times, combining earthly and heavenly genetics, material and spiritual inheritance, and our current conflicts reflect this dual nature. If archetypal, then the Watcher myth expresses something true about human consciousness, our sense of being watched, our awareness of beings greater than ourselves, our recognition that knowledge comes from beyond us, our experience of being elevated above pure animality by something we didn't generate ourselves. The Watchers remain controversial because they challenge simple categories. Were they fallen angels or misunderstood heroes? Did they corrupt humanity or enlighten it? Were their teachings evil, or was the condemnation unjust? The answer may be both, simultaneously true from different perspectives, which is why the story has been preserved but also suppressed, acknowledged but also sanitized, included in scripture but rendered safe through traditional interpretation that misses the full radical implications. And those implications are becoming unavoidable in the modern era. We now do what the Watchers did. We cross boundaries that were meant to remain closed. We combine things that were meant to stay separate. We teach knowledge that may be too dangerous for our moral development. We create beings that challenge the definition of human. We are the Watchers now, and that should terrify us. Like this video if you see the parallel, because what comes next will show exactly how the ancient pattern is repeating in our time. Chapter 9. Lamech's prophecy. Genesis 4:23-24 records Lamech's boast to his two wives, Ada and Zillah. Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. This is the Bible's first poem outside Eden, and it is a murder ballad, a celebration of violence, an escalation of vengeance that reveals how thoroughly Cain's culture had embraced might makes right ethics. But there is another Lamech who speaks prophecy, and his words hold keys to understanding the entire pre-flood narrative. Genesis 5:28-29 introduces Seth's descendant Lamech, Noah's father. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. This prophecy announced Noah's role before Noah did anything to deserve it, suggesting Lamech understood spiritual patterns, saw what was coming, and recognized his son as pivot point between ages. Two Lamechs, both seventh in their respective genealogies. Cain's Lamech, seventh from Adam through Cain, representing the fullest expression of Cain's line, violent, polygamous, boastful, yet father to the inventors of arts. Seth Lamech, seventh from Adam through Seth, representing the culmination of the righteous line, prophetic, faithful, father to humanity's savior. The parallel is too perfect to be coincidence. The biblical author is demonstrating that both lineages reached their zenith in the seventh generation, and that zenith looked completely different depending on which path was followed. Cain's Lamech lived in a world of his own making, where strength determined justice and reputation rested on feared violence. His boast was not private. It was public declaration to his wives, likely in front of his household and community. He wanted everyone to know that harming him brought exponentially more retaliation than harming Cain. This is not justice but terrorism, using extreme violence to prevent any challenge to his authority. It works short term, creating space where the strong can act without constraint, but it destroys social trust and guarantees eventual collapse. This pattern appears throughout history. Every empire built on conquest eventually falls to internal decay or external conquest. Every strong man who rules through fear eventually faces betrayal. Every society that abandons justice for expedience eventually tears itself apart. Lamech's boast represented the full flowering of Cain's philosophy, and that philosophy contained its own destruction. The civilization his children built with their inventions could not survive the moral vacuum at its center. Seth Lamech lived in awareness of divine purpose. His prophecy about Noah revealed he understood the current world was under curse, that work had become toil, that humanity needed relief. The ground that the Lord cursed refers to Genesis 3:17, where God told Adam, "The ground is cursed because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life." Lamech recognized this curse still operated, still made life harder than it should be, still separated humanity from the ease that existed in Eden, and he believed his son would somehow address this problem. Was Lamech expecting the flood? The text doesn't say explicitly, but the name Noah means rest or comfort, suggesting Lamech anticipated some kind of cessation, some break in the pattern of cursed existence. After Noah, humanity would have a fresh start, the slate wiped clean, the corruption purged. Lamech's prophecy was both blessing on his son and recognition that the current system had to end for anything better to emerge. He understood something that Cain's Lamech never grasped, that you cannot build lasting civilization on violence, that exponential vengeance leads not to security but to mutually assured destruction, that humanity needs renewal, not just improvement. The number 7 appears repeatedly in these narratives and throughout Scripture. Seventh generation, sevenfold and 77-fold vengeance, 7 days of creation, 7th-day Sabbath, 7-year cycles, 7 times 70 years of exile. 7 represents completion, fullness, the end of a cycle. When Lamech, 7th from Cain, boasted of 77-fold revenge, he was declaring that Cain's path had reached its fullest expression and could go no further without destroying itself. When Noah, son of Lamech, who was 7th from Seth, built the ark, he represented the completion of that righteous cycle and transition to new creation. Ancient numerology attached significance to generational positions. First generation receives vision, second generation struggles to maintain it. Third generation usually loses it, but 7th generation either fully realizes or fully abandons the founding vision. Jacob's son Levi, 7th from Abraham in certain counting methods, established the priesthood. David, 7th son of Jesse, established the kingdom. The pattern suggests divine orchestration, history following mathematical principles, reality operating according to hidden codes that careful observation can discern. This raises uncomfortable questions about free will and determinism. If the 7th generation inevitably faces certain patterns, are individuals free or following scripts? If Lamech's prophecy came true because he spoke it, was Noah's destiny determined by his father's words? If names carry power to shape reality, as ancient peoples believed, did calling the baby Noah create the circumstances that made flood and ark necessary? These questions challenge modern assumptions about causation, about whether the future is open or closed, about whether prophecy predicts or creates what it announces. Scripture affirms both divine sovereignty and human responsibility, never fully resolving the tension. God plans and humans choose, yet somehow both are fully operative without cancelling each other. Lamech's prophecy didn't force Noah to build the ark, but it prepared Noah to recognize divine calling when it came. Cain's Lamech's boast didn't force his culture into violence, but it crystallized and accelerated tendencies already present. Prophecy, whether divine or demonic, blessing or curse, participates in creating the future it describes, collapsing probability waves into concrete outcomes through the power of authoritative speech. Modern research into observer effects in quantum physics, placebo and nocebo effects in medicine, self-fulfilling prophecies in sociology, and manifestation in psychology all point toward the same truth the ancients knew. Consciousness shapes reality, expectations influence outcomes, belief becomes experience. We are not passive observers of a mechanical universe, but active participants in a responsive cosmos that arranges itself according to the stories we tell and the meanings we assign. The question is not whether we have this power, but whether we use it consciously or unconsciously, for construction or destruction, for blessing or curse. Lamech's prophecy blessed Noah, and through Noah blessed all humanity, giving us a way through judgment to restoration. Cain's Lamech's boast cursed his culture, accelerating its descent into violence that made judgment necessary. Both Lamechs spoke futures into being, but one spoke from relationship with the divine, while the other spoke from isolation and pride. The difference in their words' effects reveals the difference in the sources they drew from, one from heaven, one from self. As we approach what may be another transition point in human history, the question each person must answer is which Lamech we resemble. Are we boasting in our strength, threatening disproportionate retaliation against anyone who challenges us, building our security through fear and force? Or are we recognizing that the current system operates under curse, that something must give way for genuine renewal, that relief will come not through more of the same, but through catastrophic transformation that ends one age and begins another? Comment below which path you think our civilization currently follows, because the evidence we explore next suggests we are closer to the flood than most people realize. Chapter 10: The Pre-Flood Civilization. What was the world like before the flood? Genesis gives hints but few details, leaving imagination to fill the gaps. We know humanity multiplied, cities were built, metalworking and music developed, violence increased, and Nephilim walked the earth. But these fragments hardly constitute a complete picture. Alternative traditions, from the Book of Enoch to much later esoteric texts to modern channeled material, provide more elaborate descriptions. While these sources lack canonical authority, they point toward a consistent vision of pre-flood civilization as technologically advanced, morally corrupt, and spiritually aware in ways that modern civilization is only beginning to recover. Enoch describes a world where the Watcher's teachings had created a sophisticated culture. Azazel's metallurgy enabled not just weapons but also elaborate architecture, jewelry, and tools that transformed daily life. Knowledge of cosmetics meant understanding chemistry, at least empirically. Astrology required mathematical sophistication, sustained observation over generations, and record-keeping systems. Herb law demanded careful experimentation and systematic cataloging of effects. This is not primitive superstition but early science, empirical investigation of nature's patterns and principles. Jewish tradition adds details. The Targum's Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic translation and expansion of the Torah, describes the generation of Enosh, son of Seth, as beginning to make idols and calling them gods. This suggests that even Seth's line eventually corrupted, adopting practices that mingled worship of the true God with veneration of celestial bodies, angels, or Nephilim. The boundary between worshipping God and worshipping powerful created beings blurred, a pattern that repeats throughout human history whenever people encounter power without understanding its source. Islamic tradition, particularly stories preserved by medieval historians like al-Tabari, describes pre-flood humanity as possessing advanced knowledge that was lost in the deluge. Some texts claim Adam brought scrolls from Eden containing astronomical tables, medical formulae, and magical techniques. Seth supposedly inscribed this knowledge on pillars that survived the flood, allowing post-flood humanity to eventually recover what was lost. While these stories are late and legendary, they preserve a consistent theme. The flood represented catastrophic loss of knowledge and technology that took millennia to rediscover. Esoteric traditions go further. Theosophy, developed by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century, describes Atlantis as the fourth root race, a global civilization that achieved technology exceeding ours before destroying itself through misuse of spiritual forces. The Atlanteans supposedly mastered what we would call psychic abilities, using consciousness to manipulate matter, energy, and even time. They created hybrid beings through genetic manipulation and spiritual invocation, resulting in the monstrous races that mythologies worldwide describe. Their civilization collapsed when leaders grew tyrannical, using advanced knowledge to enslave and exploit, triggering natural catastrophes that submerged their lands. Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, described Atlantis in thousands of trance readings given in the early 20th century. He spoke of three destructions, the final around 10,000 BCE, breaking the remaining continent into islands that eventually sank. Cayce described Atlantean technology based on crystals that focused energy, enabling wireless power, healing, communication, and eventually weapons. He claimed many souls currently incarnating carry Atlantean karma, returning to resolve issues from that era, and that Atlantean records would be discovered in a hall beneath the Sphinx, revealing their history and warning future generations against repeating their mistakes. These esoteric accounts are not scripture and should not be treated as historical fact, but they point toward a persistent human intuition that current civilization is not the first, that advanced cultures rose before and fell catastrophically, that some knowledge from those times survived and was carefully guarded, and that we are now approaching technological and spiritual capacities similar to what destroyed them. This intuition appears in myths worldwide: Plato's Atlantis, Hindu accounts of Dvapara Yuga's advanced civilization, Mayan prophecies of multiple world ages, Hopi traditions of previous worlds destroyed by fire, ice, and flood. Archaeological anomalies fuel these speculations. The Antikythera mechanism, a Greek device from around 100 BCE, uses complex gearing to calculate astronomical positions with precision that should have been impossible for that era. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar from Parthian times containing copper and iron that may have generated electrical current. The Saqqara bird, an Egyptian wooden artifact from 200 BCE with aerodynamic properties suggesting knowledge of aircraft design. The Piri Reis map from 1513, apparently copied from much earlier sources, showing Antarctica's coastline before it was covered by ice, details that should have been unknown until the 20th century. More controversial are structures like the Great Pyramid, built with precision that challenges explanation, even with modern technology, or Baalbek's foundation stones, some weighing over 800 tons, moved and placed with unknown methods, or Puma Punku in Bolivia, featuring precisely cut stones with complex interlocking joints that look machine-tooled. Conventional archaeology dates these structures to known civilizations, Egyptians, Romans, Tiwanaku, and explains their construction through slave labor, simple tools, and decades of effort. But alternative researchers argue the precision, scale, and sophistication suggest more advanced techniques, possibly inherited from earlier civilizations or guided by beings with superior knowledge. The flood narrative itself preserves memory of catastrophic sea level rise. The last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than today. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose, submerging coastal regions where early civilizations would have concentrated. The Mediterranean basin may have been dry, or nearly so. The Persian Gulf did not exist. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake until around 5600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus, flooding the basin in what some geologists call a mega-flood that may have inspired the biblical flood narrative. If substantial human populations and developed cultures existed in these now underwater regions, their destruction by rising seas would have seemed like divine judgment, the world drowning, everything familiar disappearing beneath the waves. Survivors would have fled to higher ground, carrying fragmentary memories and salvaged knowledge, founding new societies that preserved stories of the drowned world. Over generations, these memories would morph into myths, the geographic specifics lost, but the essential narrative retained. Humanity sinned, God judged, water destroyed, few survived. The world began again. This suggests the biblical flood narrative is both historical and theological, rooted in actual catastrophe, but interpreted through theological lens to convey divine truth. The physical flood was regional or global, depending on how large the human population had spread. The spiritual flood was universal, representing God's judgment on corruption and His grace in preservation. The flood's historicity doesn't depend on whether water literally covered Everest, but on whether a catastrophic event destroyed the known world of that time, forcing humanity to restart civilization from scattered survivors. What makes this relevant to us is the possibility that we are rebuilding what was destroyed, recovering technologies and capacities that existed before, approaching the same threshold that triggered the previous catastrophe. If the pre-flood world combined advanced technology with moral corruption, we are following the same path, splitting atoms, editing genes, creating artificial intelligence, reaching for godlike powers while remaining ethically adolescent. If the Watcher's forbidden teachings enabled the pre-flood civilization to excel materially while collapsing spiritually, We are receiving similar teachings today, information flooding in faster than wisdom can integrate, knowledge accelerating beyond understanding. The prophetic pattern suggests what follows excess. The flood came after the mixing of separated lines, after boundaries were breached, after power accumulated in beings who lacked sufficient restraint. Jesus said in Matthew 24:37, "As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." He was warning that the conditions preceding judgment would repeat, that human civilization would once again reach a point where divine intervention became necessary, where the system had to be reset because corruption had become terminal. Subscribe now if you sense we are in those days, because the evidence is mounting, and the next chapter will show exactly how the ancient technologies are returning. Chapter 11. Manuscript Traditions Through History. If texts preserving pre-flood knowledge survived into post-flood world, how did they survive and where did they go? Tracking manuscript traditions through history reveals a pattern of preservation, suppression, loss, rediscovery, and concealment that suggests powerful groups have always understood that certain knowledge must be controlled, must not reach the masses, must remain the privilege of initiates. This is the story of the hidden stream, wisdom that flows beneath official history, sometimes surfacing, more often concealed, always present for those who know where to look. The earliest post-flood civilizations, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indus Valley, appeared with sophisticated knowledge already developed: writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law codes, and religious systems. Conventional history attributes this to independent invention, but the speed of their emergence suggests inherited knowledge, teachings that survived the catastrophe and were implemented by survivors and their immediate descendants. Sumerian king lists include rulers who reigned before the flood for tens of thousands of years, obviously legendary but preserving memory of a prior age. Egyptian priests told Herodotus and later Plato that their civilization was already ancient, that their records went back thousands of years before Greek contact, that they possessed knowledge from earlier cycles. Plato's Atlantis story came from Egyptian priests in size who claimed their records preserved events from 9,000 years earlier, about 9,600 BCE. Whether Atlantis was literal or symbolic, the priests' claim to possess ancient knowledge was real. Egyptian temples contained libraries, most destroyed when Rome converted to Christianity, but some texts survived, particularly those hidden by priests who foresaw the destruction. The Library of Alexandria represented an attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place. Founded around 300 BCE, it collected hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the known world: Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, Persian, Indian, texts on every subject from mathematics to poetry to magic. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE damaged it. Christian mobs in 309 CE destroyed the Serapeum, the library's daughter institution. Arab conquest in 641 CE is often blamed for the final destruction, though this is disputed. What is certain is that the vast majority of Alexandria's holdings were lost forever, but not all. Some texts were copied before the libraries burned. Some were hidden by scholars who saw disaster coming. Some survived in distant monasteries, in private collections, in translation to languages that preserved them after originals disappeared. The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden around 70 CE and discovered in 1947, show how texts can survive millennia in the right conditions. The Nag Hammadi Library, buried around 400 CE and found in 1945, preserved Gnostic Gospels that mainstream Christianity had suppressed. These discoveries prove that ancient peoples did hide texts, expecting future generations to find them. Medieval Europe saw systematic suppression of non-Christian texts. The Catholic Church destroyed pagan writings, banned heretical gospels, and burned books deemed dangerous to faith. The Inquisition targeted not just people, but books, seeking out and destroying Cathar texts, Waldensian writings, Jewish mystical works, and Islamic philosophy. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, maintained from 1559 to 1966, listed thousands of forbidden books Catholics were prohibited from reading without permission. This censorship was effective. Most medieval Europeans never encountered ideas outside official doctrine. But suppression was never complete. Monasteries copied ancient texts, often without understanding their full significance, preserving Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers who would have been lost otherwise. Islamic scholars translated Greek philosophy and science into Arabic, preserving and expanding on knowledge that Christian Europe had abandoned, then later retranslating into Latin, reintroducing it to the West during the Renaissance. Jewish Kabbalists maintained oral traditions and written texts encoding mystical teachings about creation, divine names, and spiritual ascension. Secret societies emerged to preserve knowledge that official institutions rejected. The Knight Templar, founded 1119, supposedly discovered something beneath Solomon's temple during the Crusades, texts or artifacts that gave them power and wealth, eventually leading to their suppression in 1777. What did they find? Officially, nothing, but legends speak of scrolls predating Solomon, possibly from before the flood, containing knowledge that the temple's builders had preserved. The Rosicrucians, first mentioned in 1614, claimed access to ancient wisdom from a hidden college of sages who possessed secrets of nature and spirit. Freemasonry developed elaborate initiation rituals said to preserve builders' mysteries from Solomon's temple and before. These groups shared characteristics. They required initiation, tested candidates before revealing higher knowledge. They used symbols and coded language to conceal meanings from outsiders. They claimed lineages tracing back to ancient sources, Egypt, Babylon, even pre-flood. They taught that exoteric religion for the masses concealed esoteric truth for initiates. They emphasized direct experience of divine reality over received dogma. They attracted intellectuals, artists, and political leaders, gaining influence disproportionate to their numbers. And they were consistently opposed by religious authorities who saw them as threats. The Renaissance and Enlightenment brought renewed interest in ancient texts. Scholars learned Greek and Hebrew, translated biblical texts from original languages, compared versions, identified contradictions and editorial layers. They discovered that scripture had a human history, was composed, edited, compiled, transmitted through imperfect processes that introduced variations and errors. This discovery threatened religious authority, which depended on the Bible being perfect and unchanging. Authorities tried to suppress this research, but printing made suppression impossible. Knowledge spread beyond institutional control. The 19th century saw an explosion of alternative spirituality and occult revival. Theosophy emerged, claiming to preserve ancient wisdom from Atlantis, Lemuria, and hidden masters in Tibet. Spiritualism emerged, contacting the dead through mediums, receiving messages from beyond. A Metic order of the Golden Dawn emerged, teaching ceremonial magic based on Kabbalah, alchemy, and Egyptian symbolism. Anthroposophy emerged, teaching reincarnation and spiritual evolution. These movements shared belief that mainstream religion had lost essential truths, that ancient peoples knew secrets modern people forgot. The direct spiritual experience was possible through proper techniques. The 20th century brought archaeological discoveries that challenged and sometimes confirmed traditional narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in 1853 but not fully translated until decades later, contained a flood narrative predating Genesis, suggesting the biblical flood story drew from earlier Mesopotamian sources. The Ugaritic texts, discovered in 1929, showed that early Israelites borrowed heavily from Canaanite mythology, that Yahweh shared characteristics with the god El, that biblical monotheism developed from polytheistic origins. The Gnostic Gospels of Nag Hammadi presented a Christian tradition radically different from the one that survived, emphasizing knowledge over faith, divine spark within over divine command without. Modern digital technology has made suppression nearly impossible. Texts that were rare, fragile, or forbidden are now scanned and available online. Ancient manuscripts in obscure languages are being translated and disseminated. Fringe theories and alternative histories spread through social media faster than authorities can debunk. The gatekeepers have lost control. Information flows freely, for better and worse. Truth and lies, wisdom and foolishness, revelation and deception all mix in the digital stream. requiring discernment that most people lack. The Nod manuscripts, if they exist beyond the stories told about them, fit this pattern. Ancient texts preserved through catastrophe, hidden by initiates, surfacing occasionally to inspire or terrify, then disappearing again, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to receive their message. That moment may be now. Digital age makes secrecy impossible and also makes truth indistinguishable from fiction. The perfect conditions for releasing knowledge that was too dangerous for earlier ages but that current age needs, regardless of whether we are ready. Like this video if you believe hidden knowledge is surfacing now, because what we examine next will show why religious authorities fear these texts more than any atheist argument ever could. Chapter 12. The Gnostic Perspective. Gnosticism represents Christianity's suppressed sibling, a movement that emerged alongside Orthodox Christianity in the 1st century CE, but was eventually branded heretical and systematically destroyed. Gnostic texts present radically different interpretations of Genesis, including the Cain and Abel story, seeing in them not sin and judgment, but awakening and liberation. Understanding the Gnostic perspective on Nod and Cain's descendants illuminates why mainstream religion rejected these texts and why they remain controversial today. The core Gnostic belief is that the material world was created not by the highest god, but by a lower deity, the demiurge, identified with the God of the Old Testament. This demiurge, also called Yaldabaoth or Sackless, is ignorant, arrogant, and jealous, creating the physical universe as a prison for divine sparks of consciousness that rightfully belong in the higher spiritual realm. Humans are these trapped sparks, divine in essence but imprisoned in flesh, kept ignorant of their true nature by the demiurge and his archons, the rulers of this world. In this framework, the serpent in Eden is not the villain but the hero, a messenger from the true God beyond the demiurge, sent to awaken Adam and Eve from their servitude. The fruit was not sin but enlightenment, not disobedience but self-realization. The demiurge commanded Adam and Eve not to eat because he wanted them ignorant and obedient like livestock. The serpent revealed that eating would make them like God, knowing good and evil, which was not a temptation to pride but a promise of restored divinity. The subsequent expulsion from Eden was not punishment but liberation, exit from the prison farm into the wider world where awakening could continue. Cain, in this interpretation, represents the next stage of awakening. Abel's sacrifice was accepted by the demiurge because animal sacrifice pleased the bloodthirsty creator of this world. Cain's offering of crops was rejected because it represented humanity sustaining itself through its own labor rather than appeasing divine hunger through blood. Cain's murder of Abel was not simple jealousy, but rejection of the sacrificial system, killing the aspect of humanity that willingly submitted to the demiurge's demands. God's mark on Cain was not protection, but recognition that Cain had fully awakened, had severed his connection to the false god's authority and could no longer be controlled through normal means. Cain's journey to Nod becomes in Gnostic reading, a journey to the land of self-governance, where humans awakened to their divine nature live without submission to the demiurge. The inhabitants of Nod were already awakened ones, light-bearers who assisted Cain in establishing civilization based on knowledge rather than faith, on human creativity rather than divine command, on reason rather than revelation. Cain's descendants, the inventors and builders, carried this enlightened legacy, developing arts and sciences that freed humanity from dependence on divine mercy or intervention. The secret book of John, discovered at Nag Hammadi, describes complex cosmology with multiple divine emanations. The highest God, the invisible spirit, generates pairs of divine attributes, eons, that constitute the pleroma or fullness of divinity. The lowest aeon, Sophia, wisdom, desires to create without her consort and produces the demiurge, a malformed being who doesn't realize he is not the ultimate God. The demiurge creates the material world and humanity, trapping sparks from Sophia within physical bodies. The true God sends Christ not to die for sins, but to reveal hidden knowledge that enables these trapped sparks to escape materiality and return to the pleroma. Cain, in this system, is a pneumatic, a spiritual person led by the divine spark within. Abel is a psychic, led by soul but still attached to materiality. Most of humanity are helics, led purely by material concerns without access to higher consciousness. The conflict between Cain and Abel represents the necessary struggle between spiritual awakening and religious complacency, between self-determined enlightenment and submissive piety. Cain's victory, though condemned by the demiurge, was spiritually necessary for human evolution. This interpretation inverts everything traditional Christianity teaches. Good becomes evil, evil becomes good. The God of the Bible becomes the villain. The serpent and Cain become heroes. Salvation comes not through Christ's sacrifice, but through secret knowledge, not through faith, but through gnosis. Understanding why this inversion is so compelling to some and so horrifying to others is key to grasping the enduring controversy around the Nod manuscripts and similar texts. For those who find traditional religion oppressive, who experience biblical morality as guilt-inducing control, who see institutional religion as serving power rather than truth, Gnosticism offers liberation. It says the problem is not your rebellion, but the system itself, not your doubt, but the doctrine, not your questions, but the answers you have been given. It validates the inner sense that something is wrong with this world, that suffering and injustice should not characterize a creation by a good God, that perhaps the God of this world is not the ultimate God. It promises that awakening is possible, that hidden knowledge can free you, that your divine essence transcends all earthly limitations. For those who find meaning in traditional religion, who experience biblical morality as protective boundaries, who see institutional religion as preserving truth against chaos, Gnosticism represents ultimate blasphemy. It denies the goodness of creation, calling God evil. It denies the incarnation's meaning, treating Jesus as revealer rather than redeemer. It denies sin's reality, calling disobedience enlightenment. It elevates pride, the root sin, to highest virtue. It destroys the possibility of grace, making salvation depend on knowledge that only elites possess. It produces arrogance in initiates who think themselves spiritually superior to the unenlightened masses. Both perspectives contain truth. The world does contain oppressive religious systems that manipulate through guilt and fear, that resist questions, that protect institutional power at the expense of individual seekers. But Gnosticism does produce spiritual pride, does divide humanity into superior and inferior categories, does sometimes lead to moral relativism where anything is justified if it serves awakening. The question is not which perspective is perfectly right, but which dangers concern you more: authoritarian control or anarchic license, false comfort or devastating truth, the prison of dogma or the chaos of pure freedom. The Nod manuscripts in this framework would be quintessentially Gnostic texts, teaching that Cain's path leads to enlightenment, that the demiurge's condemnation is actually validation, that the knowledge possessed by Cain's descendants is what humanity needs for liberation from false religion and false gods. Orthodox suppression of these manuscripts would be expected, necessary to maintain the power structure that depends on people not realizing they are imprisoned, not questioning the authorities, not seeking knowledge beyond approved channels. But there is a danger in accepting this Gnostic narrative too easily. It flatters the ego, makes you feel special for seeing through the deception, creates new hierarchies while claiming to destroy old ones, potentially leads to same authoritarianism it claims to oppose. Every rebel eventually becomes the establishment they overthrew if they lack humility and wisdom. Gnosticism's emphasis on hidden knowledge for elites recreates the gatekeeping it condemns in Orthodox religion, just with different gates and different keepers. The truth may be that both Orthodox and Gnostic perspectives capture partial truths, that reality is more paradoxical than either system allows, that both the God of the Bible and the Gnostic demiurge are human projections onto a divine mystery that transcends all conceptual frameworks, that Cain was neither simply murderer nor simply hero, but a complex human being whose legacy contains both blessing and curse, creation and destruction, enlightenment and violence. But accepting this nuanced middle path requires tolerating ambiguity that most humans find unbearable. We want simple answers, clear categories, obvious good guys and bad guys, and that desire makes us vulnerable to anyone offering certainty, whether orthodox dogmatist or Gnostic mystagogue. Comment below whether you find the Gnostic interpretation compelling or horrifying, and explain why. Because understanding our reactions to these ideas reveals more about ourselves than about the ideas themselves, and that self-knowledge is the first step toward genuine discernment. Chapter 13, Archaeological Mysteries. Does physical evidence support the narrative of pre-flood civilization, watchers, Nephilim, and advanced knowledge? Mainstream archaeology says no, that all evidence fits the standard model of gradual human development, from primitive to complex, from hunter-gatherers to farmers to urban civilizations, with no need to invoke lost super-civilizations or extraterrestrial intervention. But alternative researchers point to anomalies that challenge this comfortable narrative, structures that seem too sophisticated for their attributed dates, artifacts that seem out of place in time, legends consistent across cultures that may preserve historical memory rather than mere mythology. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the most famous anomaly. Conventional Egyptology dates it to around 2560 BCE, attributing it to Pharaoh Khufu, believing it was built as a tomb using copper tools, wooden sledges, and massive human labor over about 20 years. But problems with this model abound. The precision is extraordinary, base level to within fractions of an inch over 750-foot lengths, orientation to cardinal directions within minutes of arc, blocks weighing up to 80 tons placed with almost no mortar gaps. The internal construction includes granite blocks transported from quarries 500 miles away, shafts aligned to specific stars, chambers with corbelled roofs distributing weight precisely to prevent collapse. No hieroglyphic inscriptions identify Khufu as builder. That attribution rests on graffiti in relieving chambers above the king's chamber, graffiti that some alternative researchers claim is forged. No burial remains were ever found, suggesting it was not a tomb. The mathematics encoded in its dimensions, ratios involving pi and phi, suggest sophisticated knowledge of geometry. The alignment suggests astronomical knowledge and purpose. The engineering suggests understanding of acoustics, energy, and forces that conventional Egyptology does not credit to Bronze Age builders. Alternative theories propose the pyramid is older, perhaps by thousands of years, built by a civilization predating dynastic Egypt, later dynasties merely maintaining and using structures they inherited but did not build. Geological evidence of water erosion on the Sphinx, noted by geologist Robert Schoch, suggests it experienced heavy rainfall that ended around 7000 BCE, millennia before conventional dating. Alignments of Giza pyramids and other structures to constellations as they appeared around 10,500 BCE, calculated by Robert Bauval in his Orion correlation theory, suggest the site plan preserves astronomical configurations from that remote era. If structures at Giza predate dynastic Egypt, who built them? A pre-flood civilization? Atlantis? Survivors of an earlier catastrophe? The evidence is contested. Mainstream Egyptologists reject the alternative theories as speculative, but the questions remain. How did Bronze Age people with primitive tools achieve precision that modern builders struggle to match? Why does Egyptian history show greatest sophistication at the beginning, with pyramids, temple complexes, and artwork of the Old Kingdom never surpassed by later dynasties, contradicting the normal pattern where civilizations improve over time? Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, discovered in 1963 but not excavated until 1995, has forced revision of assumptions about early civilization, dated to around 9600 BCE, before agriculture, before pottery, before metal tools. It consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circular enclosures, clearly a ritual center requiring organized labor from hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked social organization for such projects. Conventional theory said religion emerged after civilization. Göbekli Tepe shows religion may have caused civilization, that shared beliefs motivated people to gather, work together, eventually settle, farm, and build cities. But Göbekli Tepe also raises questions about lost knowledge. The site shows no signs of earlier practice structures, appearing fully formed with sophisticated carving and engineering from the start. Then, around 8000 BCE, the complex was deliberately buried, filled in with debris, hidden beneath artificial hills for millennia. Why? Who had the knowledge to build it, and why did they abandon and conceal it? Was this site itself a preservation attempt, encoding knowledge in stone that would survive catastrophe, then burying it so that future generations might rediscover it when ready? Puma Punku in Bolivia presents similar mysteries. Dated to around 600 CE by conventional archaeology, this temple complex features andesite and diorite blocks cut with precision that looks machine-tooled, with flat surfaces accurate to millimeters, complex joints that fit perfectly, and mysterious grooves whose purpose remains debated. The stones are incredibly hard, rating near diamond on the Mohs scale, making cutting and drilling with primitive tools effectively impossible. Yet the work was done, the blocks were moved, some weighing over 100 tons, transported from quarries miles away without wheels or draft animals. Ancient astronaut theorists propose extraterrestrial assistance, that advanced aliens visited Earth in antiquity, taught primitive humans, enabled construction of these impossible monuments, and left after establishing early civilizations. Proponents point to worldwide myths of sky gods descending, teaching, interbreeding with humans, and eventually departing, promising to return. This is essentially the Watcher narrative, with extraterrestrials replacing angels, forbidden knowledge becoming alien technology transfer, and Nephilim becoming human-alien hybrids. This theory is simultaneously the most controversial and the most popular alternative explanation. It appears in books like Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken, television shows like Ancient Aliens, and countless documentaries. Critics rightly point out that it underestimates ancient human ingenuity, relies on arguments from ignorance. We don't know how they did it, therefore aliens, and often has racist undertones. Non-European peoples couldn't have built these structures, therefore aliens must have helped. But stripped of overreach and prejudice, the core observation stands. Some ancient structures demonstrate capabilities that challenge our assumptions about the limits of ancient technology. The question is not whether aliens visited, but whether ancient peoples had access to knowledge or techniques that later ages lost. If pre-flood civilization achieved sophistication comparable to or exceeding ours, and if the flood or other catastrophe destroyed it, survivors would have preserved fragments of that knowledge, passing them down through mystery schools and initiatory traditions, occasionally implementing them in structures that mainstream archaeology cannot explain. The builders would appear to later peoples as superhuman, their knowledge as magical, their works as impossible, inspiring myths of giants, gods, and demigods. This interpretation fits both the biblical narrative and the archaeological anomalies. The Watchers were not extraterrestrials, but survivors or descendants of pre-flood civilization, possessing advanced knowledge, appearing superhuman to post-flood populations, intermarrying with Noah's descendants, producing the second generation of Nephilim, mentioned in Numbers 13:33. The knowledge they taught, metallurgy, astronomy, herbal medicine, engineering, was not invented by them, but remembered, preserved from before the flood, implemented in structures like Göbekli Tepe and Puma Punku and the pyramids, then gradually lost again as civilizations rose and fell, as catastrophes destroyed cities, as knowledge died with masters who found no worthy apprentices. The Nod manuscripts in this framework would be among the texts that preserve this knowledge, written perhaps immediately post-flood by survivors, copied and hidden by successive generations, surfacing occasionally when seekers were ready, then disappearing again when persecution arose. The knowledge itself is neutral, but its use depends on the moral state of those who possess it, capable of building or destroying, liberating or enslaving, enlightening or corrupting. And this is why access has always been controlled, why initiatory systems test candidates before revealing secrets, why some knowledge remains oral, never written, passed only from master to student in unbroken lineages that claim to trace back to the beginning. Share this video if you believe archaeology has barely scratched the surface of humanity's true history, because what we explore next will show how these ancient patterns are not merely historical curiosities but active forces shaping our present moment. Chapter 14. Theological implications. What happened to traditional theology if the nod narratives and alternative manuscript traditions are taken seriously? The implications are profound, challenging core doctrines about creation, sin, salvation, and divine justice. Religious authorities have always understood this, which is why they suppressed these texts so aggressively, allowing people to seriously consider that Cain's line achieved greatness despite divine judgment, that forbidden knowledge enabled human progress, that the flood destroyed not just wickedness but brilliance, undermines the foundational message that obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings curse. Traditional theology teaches that sin entered the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience, that this original sin corrupted human nature, that all subsequent sin stems from this first transgression, and that only divine grace through Christ's sacrifice can redeem humanity. Cain's murder of Abel is presented as the first fruit of this corrupted nature, and Cain's exile and mark are consequences of sin, warning of judgment while providing mercy. The flood is God's just response to humanity's complete corruption, and Noah's family is saved by grace alone, not by merit. But the nod narratives complicate this simple picture. If Cain built a city, married, and had descendants who invented music, metalworking, and other civilizational foundations, then his post-sin life was extraordinarily productive, not the cursed wandering that Genesis 4:12 predicted. If divine judgment included blessing, if the mark enabled rather than only restrained, if exile led to accomplishment rather than ruin, then the relationship between obedience and flourishing is not straightforward. Righteous Abel died, murdered. Wicked Cain lived, thrived, founded civilization. This is not how the moral universe is supposed to work. Traditional theology handles this in two ways. First, by emphasizing that material success is not true success, that Cain gained the world but lost his soul, that his accomplishments were empty because he remained separated from God. Second, by noting that Cain's line died in the flood, that their brilliance was temporary, that judgment eventually came. Both points are true but incomplete. They don't address why God allowed Cain to prosper for centuries if he was truly cursed, why divine judgment took so long to materialize, or what it means that civilizational foundations were laid by those outside divine favor. The uncomfortable implication is that God's kingdom and human civilization operate on different principles, that what advances civilization may actually hinder spiritual life, and that what advances spiritual life may actually hinder civilization. Contemplative monks who pray all day don't build cities or invent technologies. Ambitious entrepreneurs who build empires rarely maintain deep prayer lives. There are exceptions, but the general pattern holds. Spiritual advancement and worldly achievement require different focuses, different values, different uses of time and energy. And this raises the question whether God wants humanity to advance materially or to remain spiritually focused, whether civilization itself is rebellion or fulfillment of divine purpose. Genesis 1:28 commands humanity to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. This suggests God intended human civilization, intended development and progress, intended humans to transform the world through work and creativity. But Genesis 2:3 suggests God intended humans to live in simple relationship with Him in the garden, without toil, without technology, without the complexity that civilization requires. These two visions of human purpose are in tension, one oriented toward development, one toward communion. Cain's line pursued development, Seth's line pursued communion, and the theological question is which path better fulfills God's intention. Christianity traditionally favors Seth's path, emphasizing relationship with God over worldly achievement, storing treasures in heaven over earth, seeking first the kingdom over material concerns. But Christianity has also baptized civilization, believing that Christian faith should transform culture, that believers should be salt and light in the world. that human creativity reflects divine creativity. This creates constant tension between ascetic withdrawal and cultural engagement, between monastery and marketplace, between otherworldly focus and this worldly responsibility. The balance is difficult, and most people tilt toward one side or the other. The doctrine of common grace attempts to address this, teaching that God grants blessings to all humanity, not only the saved, enabling even unbelievers to create beauty, discover truth, and build just societies. In this framework, Cain's descendants received common grace, given talents and opportunities despite their spiritual rebellion, because God intended civilization to develop and used whoever was willing to build it. Their accomplishments served God's purposes, even though they did not serve God himself. This preserves divine sovereignty while explaining why the wicked often prosper. But it also raises disturbing questions about divine character. If God uses wicked people to accomplish his purposes, granting them success and influence, what does that say about his values? If he cursed Cain but enabled Cain's flourishing, was the curse real? If he planned to destroy Cain's line in the flood, but first allowed them to develop all civilization's foundations, did he value their achievements or not? The mixed message suggests a divine ambivalence about human civilization, recognizing it as both gift and curse, both fulfillment and rebellion, both necessary and dangerous. The Watcher's fall adds another layer. Why would angels desire to leave their assigned place and come to earth? The usual answer is pride or lust, but perhaps it was curiosity, a desire to participate in the creative work that only incarnate beings can do, to experience limitation and temporality, to taste the bittersweet nature of embodied existence. If so, their fall was not entirely different from Adam and Eve's, a reaching beyond assigned boundaries motivated by desire for expanded experience. And if their teachings advanced civilization, then their fall, like Adam's, had mixed results: loss of innocence but gain of knowledge, loss of simplicity but gain of complexity, loss of relationship but gain of achievement. This suggests that the fall, both human and angelic, was not simply catastrophe but transition, a painful but perhaps necessary movement from childlike dependence to adult responsibility, from unconscious innocence to conscious moral agency, from gift to task. Theology typically treats the fall as tragedy, but perhaps it was also birth, the traumatic but essential emergence from paradise into history, from stasis into development, from eternal safety into temporal risk. And if the fall was birth, then exile to Nod was not ultimate punishment but sending forth, the equivalent of leaving parental home to establish one's own life, scary and dangerous but also necessary for maturity. This interpretation radically changes the meaning of salvation. Instead of returning to Eden, to the pre-fall state of innocent obedience, salvation means moving forward to an integrated state that combines Eden's relationship with Nod's knowledge, vertical connection with horizontal extension, contemplation with creation. It means becoming fully human, which is what humanity was always meant to become. Beings who unite heaven and earth, spirit and matter, divine image with creative agency. The eschakanton is not return but completion, not restoration but fulfillment, not the garden recovered but the city perfected, the new Jerusalem descending from heaven to earth, God dwelling with humanity in a setting that is both garden and city, both natural and constructed. This vision appears in Revelation 21 to 22, the final chapters of the Bible. The New Jerusalem has walls, gates, streets, foundations, all features of a city, all products of human construction. But it also has the tree of life and the river of life, features of Eden, products of divine provision. God dwells there, but humanity dwells there too, not as slaves or pets, but as kings and priests, as co-rulers, as partners in eternal governance. This is integration, the resolution of the tension between Seth and Cain, between worship and work, between receiving and creating. And if this is the destination, then the entire human journey, including Cain's exile and his descendants' achievements, was necessary to reach it. Like this video if this theological exploration is opening doors in your mind that you didn't know existed, because we are not done yet. The most controversial implication is still ahead, and it concerns the nature of evil itself. Chapter 15. The Serpent's Wisdom Revisited. Every tradition in this investigation circles back to the serpent, the mysterious figure who initiated the entire drama by tempting Eve to eat forbidden fruit. Traditional theology identifies the serpent with Satan, the devil, the adversary, the ultimate source of evil who sought to corrupt God's good creation from the beginning. But alternative traditions offer different interpretations, seeing the serpent as hero, liberator, wisdom teacher, or at minimum a more ambiguous figure than Orthodox Christianity allows. Understanding the serpent is crucial to understanding Nod, Cain, the Watchers, and the entire trajectory of human history. Genesis 3:1 introduces the serpent as more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. This description is strange. The serpent is the created being, made by God, yet possessing a quality, craftiness, that exceeds other animals. Crafty can be translated as shrewd, clever, or wise, terms that are not inherently negative. Proverbs 12:16 says, "A prudent man conceals knowledge," using a related Hebrew word. The serpent's craftiness was not necessarily evil, but it was dangerous because it operated from understanding that exceeded straightforward obedience. The serpent's words to Eve are fascinating. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? This challenges Eve to examine what God actually commanded versus what she has been told or assumed. It is the first question in the Bible, the introduction of critical thought, the suggestion that authority should be questioned and claims examined. Eve responds, correcting the serpent's overstatement. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.'" Notice that Eve adds a prohibition that Genesis 2:17 did not include. God said not to eat, but he did not say not to touch. Eve has expanded the boundary, suggesting that either Adam added this in transmitting God's command, or Eve is being ultra-cautious, or oral tradition had already begun embellishing divine instruction. The serpent corrects her. "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." This is the critical claim, that eating will not cause death, but will cause godlikeness, and that God prohibited it not to protect, but to prevent human elevation. Was the serpent lying? Genesis 3:7 says their eyes were opened immediately after eating, confirming that part of the serpent's promise. Genesis 3:22 records God saying, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil," confirming the serpent's central claim. The only potential lie is about death, but Genesis 2:17 said, "In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die," and Adam lived 930 years after eating. Traditional theology says spiritual death occurred immediately and physical death entered the world as eventual consequence. But that requires interpreting die in a way that the text does not explicitly support. The serpent's promise was more literally true than God's warning. This creates a profound theological problem. Eve faced a choice between obedience based on incomplete information and disobedience based on truer information. The traditional response is that Eve should have obeyed regardless, that questioning God is inherently wrong, that the content of the command matters less than the relationship of submission. But this makes morality entirely about power, not about truth, about who has authority to command, not about whether commands are just or wise, and that is a dangerous foundation for ethics. Alternative traditions embrace the serpent's perspective. Gnostic texts identify the serpent with Christ, both bringing saving knowledge, both opposed by the demiurge who created the world as a prison. The Ophitai sect of Gnostics venerated the serpent, seeing in Genesis 3 not humanity's fall but humanity's awakening, not the entrance of sin but the beginning of consciousness. Satanism, both theistic and atheistic, honors the serpent as symbol of rebellion, knowledge, individualism, and self-determination. Modern witchcraft traditions see the serpent as representing earth wisdom, pre-Christian goddess spirituality, and the path of direct experience over mediated authority. These interpretations horrify traditional Christians, and understandably so. They invert the biblical narrative completely, making the villain into the hero and implying that the God of the Bible is actually the oppressor from whom humanity needs liberation. This is not merely alternative interpretation. It is hostile reframing, spiritual warfare using the Bible's own text against its intended message. It is precisely what Paul warned against in 2 Corinthians 11:3, where he said the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, and he feared believers' minds might be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. But dismissing the serpent's perspective entirely requires ignoring the text's own ambiguities. Why did God place the forbidden tree in the garden if he didn't want humans to eat from it? Why make it desirable, good for food, a delight to the eyes, desired to make one wise, if the entire purpose was to test obedience? Why not place it outside the garden or make it repulsive or hide it? The tree's placement and attractiveness suggest God intended humans to eventually eat from it, that the prohibition was not permanent but developmental, a boundary meant for children that would be removed when they matured. Eating too soon was the problem, not eating itself. This interpretation, common in Jewish mysticism and some Christian theology, suggests the fall was premature awakening, not wrong desire, but wrong timing, not rebellion against God's nature, but impatience with God's process. Humanity was meant to become like God eventually. Genesis 1:26 says humanity was created in God's image and likeness, but through relationship and maturity, not through grasping and theft. The serpent offered a shortcut, true knowledge, but without the relational foundation to handle it wisely, and the result was knowledge without wisdom, power without character, capability without maturity, the pattern that continues to plague humanity. In this framework, the serpent is not ultimate evil, but trickster, a figure that appears in mythologies worldwide. Coyote in Native American stories, Anansi in African tales, Loki in Norse mythology, Hermes in Greek tradition. The trickster disrupts order, crosses boundaries, reveals hidden truths, exposes hypocrisy, and forces change. The trickster is dangerous but also necessary, breaking stagnant systems, challenging corrupt authority, and introducing chaos that enables growth. The trickster's morality is ambiguous, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, always disruptive. If the serpent is trickster rather than devil, then the story changes tone. God set up a developmental process. The serpent short-circuited it. Humanity gained knowledge prematurely and faced consequences not as punishment but as natural results of premature advancement. God's response, exile from Eden, was not vindictive but necessary, removing humans from the garden where they could access the tree of life before they were ready for immortality. Imagine immortal humans with the moral development of toddlers, the horrors that would result. Death became a mercy, ensuring that mistakes were not permanent, that bad generations would eventually die, that fresh starts remained possible. Cain's connection to the serpent becomes clearer. He, like the serpent, represented the path of safe-determined advancement, refusing to accept assigned roles, killing what stood in his way, building without divine permission. His mark was serpent's mark, the sign of one who had crossed boundaries and could not return. His city was Serpent City, built on knowledge rather than obedience, on human will rather than divine command. And his descendants were serpent's children, the seed of the serpent that Genesis 3:15 prophesies will be at war with the woman's seed until the final victory. But Genesis 3:15 also says the serpent's head will be bruised, suggesting ultimate defeat. Christian theology sees this as the first gospel, the proto-evangelium, promising Christ's victory over Satan through the cross and resurrection. The serpent's children, those who follow the path of autonomous knowledge and self-directed will ultimately fail. The woman's child, those who follow the path of submission and relationship, will ultimately triumph. History moves toward this resolution, toward the final defeat of serpents' wisdom and vindication of God's. But what if the resolution is not defeat of one side by the other, but integration of both? What if Christ came not to destroy the serpent, but to redeem the serpent's gift, to take the stolen knowledge and submit it to divine love, to combine Nod's achievements with Eden's relationship, to be both carpenter and rabbi, both worker and worshipper, both fully human and fully divine? What if the New Jerusalem includes both tree of life and human architecture, because both are necessary, both are good when properly integrated? This is the most radical implication of taking the Nod manuscript seriously. They suggest that humanity's path forward is not rejection of Cain's legacy, but redemption of it. Not return to pre-fall innocence, but advancement to post-integration maturity. Not destruction of the serpent's gift, but submission of that gift to the serpent's creator. This requires acknowledging that the serpent told truth, that knowledge is not inherently evil, that human achievement is not inherently rebellion, while also acknowledging that without divine relationship, knowledge becomes poison and achievement becomes tyranny. Subscribe now and share this video if this investigation has transformed how you understand the biblical narrative, because we are approaching the climax, the moment when ancient patterns intersect with present reality in ways that demand decision. Chapter 16. Modern discoveries in digital age. How are the ancient patterns manifesting now? The parallels between our era and the days before the flood are striking, almost terrifying in their precision. Jesus said in Matthew 24:37, "As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Most people read this as general moral decline, but closer examination reveals specific technological, social, and spiritual conditions that characterized Noah's time that are emerging in ours. We are not merely similar to that era, we are recreating it with stunning accuracy. The pre-flood world combined advanced technology with moral corruption. We are doing the same. Our technological capabilities now approach what ancient texts describe the pre-flood civilization achieving. We split atoms, releasing energy that powers cities or destroys them. We edit genes, modifying organisms at the molecular level, creating hybrids that nature never produced, playing God with life itself. We build artificial intelligence, creating entities that think, learn, and make decisions, consciousness or its simulation emerging from silicon and algorithms. We manipulate weather, attempting to control rainfall and temperature. We connect minds through digital networks, creating a global nervous system where information propagates instantly to billions. These achievements mirror the forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught. Azazel's metallurgy evolved into nuclear physics and nanotechnology. His teaching of weapons evolved into drones, railguns, and autonomous killer robots. The Watchers' astrology evolved into astronomy and cosmology, mapping the universe from quantum foam to galactic clusters. Their herbal knowledge evolved into pharmacology and genetic medicine. Their cosmetics evolved into biotechnology that modifies appearance, slows aging, and promises eventual immortality through life extension therapies. We are recovering or reinventing what existed before the flood, but our moral development has not kept pace. We possess godlike powers with adolescent ethics. We can destroy the world through nuclear war, through engineered pandemics, through ecological collapse, through artificial intelligence that decides humanity is obsolete. We create technologies without considering consequences, releasing innovations before understanding implications, moving fast and breaking things, as Silicon Valley says. We are exactly like the Nephilim, possessing superhuman capabilities without superhuman wisdom, power without restraint, knowledge without love. The mixing of separated lines is occurring again, not through literal angel-human breeding, though transhumanists propose human-machine merger and genetic engineering enables hybrid creation, but through breakdown of boundaries that previously constrained human action. We mix human and animal DNA, creating chimeras for research. We mix consciousness and machine, creating brain-computer interfaces. We mix nations and cultures, creating global society where traditional boundaries dissolve. We mix genders, questioning binary categories that ancient peoples considered foundational. We mix reality and virtual, spending more time in digital spaces than physical presence. Every boundary is being breached, every separation challenged, every limit tested. This produces the same result it produced before the flood: breakdown of shared reality, breakdown of common morality, breakdown of social cohesion. Everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, truth fragmenting into a million competing narratives, power concentrating in entities, both corporate and governmental, that exercise control beyond any historical precedent. The conditions for judgment are assembling, not because God is angry, but because systems operating beyond sustainable limits inevitably collapse. The flood came not only as divine punishment, but as natural consequence, the earth unable to support the corruption that saturated it. Digital technology has democratized access to information in ways that parallel the Watcher's teachings. Anyone with internet access can learn things that were secret for millennia, can study occult practices, can explore forbidden knowledge, can connect with like-minded seekers worldwide, can bypass gatekeepers and authorities. This is liberation. Information wants to be free, as the hacker saying goes, but it is also chaos. Truth and lies, wisdom and folly, revelation and deception all flow in the same stream, indistinguishable to those without discernment. Most people lack that discernment, having been raised in educational systems that taught what to think but not how to think, that produced compliance but not wisdom. The result is mass confusion. Societies fragmenting into isolated bubbles, each convinced they possess truth and everyone else is deceived, deluded, or evil. Conspiracy theories proliferate because official narratives have lost credibility, because authorities have lied too often, because the powerful have betrayed trust repeatedly. But conspiracy thinking, while sometimes uncovering real plots, more often generates paranoid fantasies that prevent actual understanding. We are drowning in information but starving for wisdom, exactly the condition the Watcher's teachings produced, knowledge without the relational and ethical framework to use it well. The not manuscripts, if they are surfacing now, fit perfectly into this environment. Digital networks enable their dissemination. PDF files, encrypted messaging, dark web forums, blockchain storage that cannot be censored. All the tools exist to spread texts that authorities once suppressed. But the same technologies enable spread of forgeries, hoaxes, and disinformation. How does anyone know whether a text claiming to be the ancient Nod manuscript is authentic or fabricated? Without provenance, without scholarly verification, without physical artifacts to carbon date, digital texts are inherently unverifiable. The perfect conditions for revelation are also perfect conditions for deception. This means discernment is more crucial now than ever. The question to ask about any text, teaching, or revelation is not whether it is old or new, but whether it produces good fruit. Does it increase love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Or does it produce division, fear, pride, anger, and confusion? Ancient texts can be demonic. Modern texts can be inspired. Age determines nothing. Modern texts can be inspired. Age determines nothing, and source is revealed through fruit. The technological capabilities we have gained position us exactly where the pre-flood civilization stood, at a threshold where humanity must choose whether to integrate its powers with wisdom and love, or to pursue power for its own sake. To what end does not matter. The difference is that we have the flood narrative as warning. We know how that path ended. We can choose differently if we are willing. But choosing differently requires what most humans find hardest: humility, the recognition that we do not know as much as we think, that our judgments are partial, that our certainty is often pride, that we desperately need wisdom beyond ourselves. Christ's incarnation offers the model. He possessed divine power but submitted it to divine love, using his abilities only to serve, never to dominate, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, teaching the lost, and ultimately dying for those who betrayed him. This is integrated power, knowledge submitted to relationship, capability constrained by compassion. strength made perfect in weakness. This is what the pre-flood world lacked, what Cain's line never achieved, what the Watchers could not teach. And this is what our world lacks now. What technology cannot provide, what information alone cannot generate. The question for every person is whether you will follow Cain's path or Abel's, the serpent's wisdom or the lamb's love, Nod's achievements or Eden's relationship, knowledge or obedience, power or submission. The biblical narrative says you cannot serve both. Eventually, you must choose, and that choice determines not just your eternal destiny, but your present experience, who you become, what you contribute, how you affect those around you. The choice is always available, always urgent, always consequential. Comment below which path you feel called to and be honest, because pretending to choose one while living the other is the most dangerous self-deception. And that brings us to the final chapter, where everything we have explored converges into a single unavoidable conclusion. Chapter 17. The Return of Forgotten Knowledge. We have journeyed through ancient manuscripts and modern mysteries, through Cain's exile and the Watcher's fall, through Nephilim's power and Noah's rescue, through suppressed texts and resurfaced secrets. Now we stand at the threshold where all these threads converge, where past and present merge, where the return of forgotten knowledge is not future promise but present reality. The Nod manuscripts, whether physical texts or spiritual frequency, whether ancient documents or eternal truths, are here. The question is not whether they are returning, but whether we are ready to receive them wisely. Every thread in this investigation points toward integration, the reconciliation of opposites that humanity has kept separated for millennia. Cain and Seth, serpent and lamb, Nod and Eden, knowledge and obedience, power and love, achievement and relationship. These are not ultimate opposites, but complementary aspects of complete humanity. We have lived in partial consciousness, identifying with one side while projecting the other onto enemies. We have worshipped unity while practicing division, preached love while practicing judgment, claimed truth while enforcing certainty that prevents actual understanding. The return of forgotten knowledge means rediscovering what ancient peoples knew and what modern people forgot, that reality is more than matter, that consciousness is fundamental, that spiritual forces are real, that boundaries between worlds are permeable, that humans are hybrid beings combining earthly and heavenly heritage, that divine and demonic are closer than we want to admit, that evil is often twisted good rather than pure opposite, that the path forward requires embracing than resolving it through simplistic or thinking. This knowledge is dangerous, which is why it was forgotten or suppressed. It can empower liberation or justify oppression. It can produce saints or sorcerers, healers or manipulators, builders or destroyers. The knowledge itself is neutral. The heart wielding it determines the outcome, and humanity's heart remains divided, loving and hating, seeking truth while fleeing it, desiring freedom while clinging to comfortable chains, attracted to light while fascinated by darkness. We are Nephilim, hybrids combining divine and earthly, capable of greatness or horror depending on which part of ourselves we feed. The manuscript traditions preserve techniques for feeding the divine part, practices that ancient schools taught to initiate, methods for stilling the mind, opening the heart, connecting to transcendent source, channeling power for service rather than domination. These practices appear in all traditions: contemplative prayer in Christianity, Kabbalah in Judaism, Sufism in Islam, meditation in Buddhism, yoga in Hinduism, shamanic journeys in indigenous traditions. The forms differ, but the essence is identical, creating space for the divine to work, submitting ego to spirit, allowing transformation rather than forcing change. But the manuscripts also contained techniques for feeding the earthly part, for manipulating reality through will, for gaining power over circumstances and people, for achieving goals regardless of cost. These techniques work, which is why they are forbidden, because they produce results but corrupt the practitioner, because they bring temporary success but ultimate destruction, because they empower the self at the expense of relationship. turning others into objects to be used rather than persons to be loved. Every occult system contains these techniques, and every spiritual master warns against them, because the destination they lead toward is isolation, madness, and eventual collapse. The choice between these paths is not one-time decision, but moment-by-moment choosing. In every interaction, every thought, every response to circumstances. Will you manipulate or will you serve? Will you grasp or will you receive? Will you force or will you allow? Will you build your kingdom or seek first God's kingdom? These are the real questions that the not manuscripts force us to confront, not whether ancient texts exist, but whether we will live by ancient wisdom or ancient folly, by integration or division, by love or power.